Many children enjoy attending summer camps, going on trips, or even traveling abroad. These experiences allow them to discover new places and broaden their understanding of the world. However, sometimes these adventures can take a dark turn, leading to serious situations. During the summer, Brittany in France is a beautiful destination and generally considered safe, attracting thousands of schoolchildren from various countries each year. The same was true in 1996. In mid-July, a group of students from Cornwall, England, arrived in France, including a girl named Caroline Dickinson. She was one of 40 children on the trip, accompanied by 5 teachers. At 13 years old, Caroline was an average student. This was her first trip to another European country. She was excited but felt a bit down about going without her friend, and her mother had asked the teacher to look out for her. Nevertheless, Caroline quickly connected with the other children and traveled with the group to a small village named Plain Fougers of Brittany. The trip organizers had arranged for the students' accommodation at a youth hostel. Plain Fougers had only a few shops and bars, with a population of just over 3,000 people. This small, quaint village excited Caroline, as it was her first time visiting such a cozy place. After moving into the hostel for foreign guests on July 18, 1996, Caroline enjoyed making new friends and quickly became close to a girl named Kille. Unfortunately, they were assigned to different rooms. Camilla's room had 2 bunk beds, both of which were already occupied. Not wanting to go back to her own room, Caroline decided to bring her mattress into Camilla's room. She placed it on the floor between the 2 large beds and chose to spend the night there. Before going to sleep, Kille and Caroline talked for a long time. The last thing Kille remembers is singing a song about the stars with Caroline before they both fell asleep. The next morning, when the girls in the room woke up, they found Caroline lying on the floor in an unnatural position, her eyes wide open. They called her name, but she didn't respond. She was already cold. A scream of horror filled the room, drawing the attention of the teachers, who rushed in and were stunned by the sight. They immediately contacted the police. When the gendarmes arrived, they concluded that it was a murder, and the girl had died under horrific circumstances. The entire community of Plain Fougers was left in shock by the tragedy. The event was so traumatic that many found it hard to discuss. Caroline had been abused, and she died from asphyxia caused by a lump of cotton wool lodged deep in her throat, which led to her suffocation. Caroline was known for her diligence. She worked hard and excelled academically. The incident shocked not only the families of the children but also the entire French village, which had never experienced anything like it. The crime had many strange aspects. Most notably, it was hard to understand how the criminal could sneak into a room full of 5 sleeping children and kill one without waking the others. How did he manage to enter the dormitory without being seen by teachers or security? Detectives soon figured out that an outsider could gain access to the building. Fire safety regulations at the time required that entrances and exits remain open, and some were left unmonitored. This meant that anyone could easily enter the building through these doors. After the girls who shared a room with Caroline recovered from the tragedy, the police were finally able to interview them. 2 witnesses reported seeing something unusual that night. One girl woke up in the middle of the night, heard quiet moans, and noticed Caroline's legs twitching. However, she thought her roommate was just having a nightmare and decided not to investigate further. Another girl also woke up around the same time and saw a shadow move across the room toward the exit. She assumed it was one of the other girls going to the bathroom. There were no screams or anything else alarming that would have drawn anyone's attention. A development built on witness testimonies that, on the night of July 18th, Caroline chose to sleep on the floor between her friends' bunk beds so she could be close to them. Around 4 a.m., an unknown man entered the dormitory through an unlocked door. He went upstairs and found Caroline asleep on the floor. He placed a large wad of cotton in her mouth, likely to silence her, then assaulted and abused her. After killing her, he left the scene. At that same time, one of the teachers was awakened by a suspicious noise and looked out the dormitory window. She saw a stranger riding away on a motorcycle but thought he was just passing by. After seeing the stranger, she checked the sleeping areas but didn't notice anything unusual, all the children appeared to be sleeping peacefully. She chose not to turn on the lights or wake anyone, believing there was no reason to do so, and returned to her bed. The murder investigation was carried out quietly, with minimal information released. This approach was in stark contrast to similar cases in England, where press conferences were held, and the public was actively engaged to help gather information. With no new information, it appeared that the case had hit a dead end. After all required examinations, the body of Caroline was returned to her parents in England. Many people attended her funeral, hoping the criminal would be caught soon. Unfortunately, in the months that followed, no suspects emerged. The investigation stalled, and even after a year, there was still no progress. Many criticized the French police for their poor handling of the case and lack of professionalism. Caroline's parents, John and Sue, and their daughter Jenny, had made the harrowing journey to France. They returned to the small village in Brittany on the anniversary of his daughter's death. He was frustrated by the detectives' lack of communication and their failure to engage the public in the investigation. He made a public appeal for help, urging the local community to remember the tragic events surrounding the death of his 13-year-old daughter. John called on residents to share any information they might have about the case, hoping to find the person responsible. Caroline's father were astonished to find out that no fingerprints had been collected from the crime scene. In the early stages of the investigation, officers simply went door to door to talk to local residents. However, the lead detective refused to collect DNA samples from all the men in the village, even though the number of men was small. This refusal seemed unreasonable, especially given the specific nature of the killer's actions. John believed that the perpetrator lived nearby, was familiar with the area, and could easily come and go without being noticed. As John examined the French police procedures more closely, their frustration grew. In the end, he decided to reach out to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to request pressure on the French authorities for a more comprehensive investigation. Thanks to the campaign he initiated, his request was approved in August 1997, which led to significant media pressure on the gendarmes. This situation even resulted in the dismissal of the detectives who were responsible for the initial investigation in France. The new lead detective quickly concentrated on the early mistakes made in the case. They chose to reassess the limited evidence and review most of the information. However, with over a year having passed since the murder, this task proved to be quite challenging. Key witnesses were interviewed again, and based on their statements, a new composite sketch of the suspected killer was created. All information was made public promptly to prevent the same mistakes from happening again. The court also approved the victim's parents' request for DNA testing of all the men in the town where their daughter was killed. This was the first mass DNA testing conducted in the history of forensic science in Britain. Caroline's father had previously believed that the attacker was a local resident, but the testing ultimately revealed no matches. Investigators were compelled to adopt new strategies and consider events beyond the village. During this process, a new detective uncovered a troubling link to an incident in the nearby village of St. Lenaire. On the night Caroline Dickinson was murdered, an unknown man had entered a youth hostel in St. Lenaire where students were staying. The intruder entered a room where 4 teenagers were sleeping but was quickly spotted. Lights were turned on, causing chaos that forced him to flee. Following a failed abuse attempt in a field, the suspect had allegedly traveled 25 kilometers in search of a new victim. Unfortunately, this crucial lead was overlooked during the initial investigation, as no one was harmed in this incident, resulting in very few details about the man. Detectives focused on the 4 witnesses from the youth hostel who had seen the likely assailant clearly in the light. Once located and interviewed, their insights helped refine a composite sketch of the suspect. As details about the mysterious abuser circulated across France, authorities alerted all youth hostels and dormitories about the situation. They also collected information on similar crimes from comparable organizations. Although data was scarce, the number of potential suspects gradually increased. By the end of 1997, approximately 3,000 local men were identified as possible offenders. To definitively determine the killer's identity, all must undergo testing and DNA profiling. This extensive process took nearly 2 years, as investigators treated the case with utmost seriousness. After some time, investigators repeatedly encountered the name Francisco Arce Montes. He is a 47-year-old Spanish citizen with a long history of criminal activity across several European countries. His first arrest was in Germany during the 1980s, where he received a 5-year sentence for abuse. Following that, he carried out an attack in the Netherlands, resulting in a few months of imprisonment. In 1994, he was arrested in France for attempting to assault a girl at a youth hostel. His appearance matched the composite sketch created from witness descriptions. Upon examining his criminal history, detectives discovered at least 10 similar incidents across Europe, all involving the abuse of girls and teenagers in youth hostels. Unfortunately, tracking him down proved difficult since he was a migrant, continuously moving between countries and making it possible for him to be anywhere in Europe or beyond. By the end of the 1990s, Francisco had gained notoriety among law enforcement agencies throughout Europe. He emerged as the prime suspect among the various candidates. To focus solely on him and rule out the others, it was essential to apprehend Francisco and obtain a DNA sample from him. Meanwhile, testing continued, and gradually, the list of 3,000 suspects was narrowed down, eliminating individuals one by one. Francisco managed to evade capture so effectively that, at one point, even the victim's parents began to question if he would ever be found. In March, a group of Irish students went on vacation and stayed at a youth hostel near the beach. That evening, an unknown man entered one of their rooms, but 2 female students caught him. He insisted he had entered the wrong room by mistake and quickly left. Although the girls were worried about what had happened, they chose not to report the incident, assuming the man was simply confused because he was drunk. The next day, this man was seen in the same hostel. He was found in one of the rooms and acting suspiciously around 2 a.m. Shortly after, he left, claiming he had confused the rooms. 4 girls who witnessed this immediately called emergency services to report a break-in and an abuse. One of the girls stated that she had been abused while she slept. She provided her underwear for examination and consented to all necessary tests. The police caught the mysterious criminal after one of the Irish students recognized him the following day. The girl was in the room that was broken into yesterday and noticed the suspicious man walking around the pool as if nothing had happened. She immediately called 911, and he was arrested. He was taken to the Miami Beach Police Department for questioning. The man denied being involved in the suspicious activities at the youth hostel over the past few days. During his interview with law enforcement, he eventually provided his real name, Francisco Montes. He claimed to be a solo traveler who had spent considerable time in South America and European countries, including Germany and France, and was currently traveling around the United States. During his conversation with the detectives, he made several strange, claiming he hadn't committed any crime and that he had merely entered other people's rooms by accident while drunk. Francisco repeatedly asked, in anger, whether masturbation was illegal in the United States, suggesting that his actions weren't harmful. His behavior was both provocative and odd. He ultimately took a DNA test and was held for further investigation. By this time, Caroline's murder had gone cold, until Tommy Onko, an immigration officer at the Detroit airport, picked up a British newspaper and read a story about the 5th anniversary of the unsolved murder. The article named Montes as a possible suspect, and on a whim, Onko decided to look up immigration information to see if a man by that name had ever been to the United States. He found the name of Francisco Arce Montes, who was in fact in police custody in Miami Beach. Onko contacted French and British authorities and was able to confirm Francisco's date of birth and hometown. Meanwhile, Montes was arrested in Miami Beach for abusing an Irish tourist at a youth hostel. The crime was similar to the modus operandi in Caroline's case, with Montes being able to enter the girls' rooms without waking the victim or her roommate. Francisco was arrested by Sergeant, later Major, Angel Vasquez of the Miami Beach Police Department. Major Vasquez obtained a DNA sample from Montes, which matched the DNA from the male fluid at the Irish students' youth hostel. In addition, Major Vasquez linked Montes to 4 other similar incidents in Miami Beach. Combined with Onko's sources, investigators linked Francisco to Caroline's murder. Francisco's DNA was later matched to DNA from the Caroline Dickinson murder investigation. The state of Florida suspended charges against Francisco to allow for his extradition to France to face charges for Caroline's murder. Finally, there was a genuine possibility of solving Caroline's murder. The major obstacle was the distance. At any moment, Francisco could be released on bail and vanish, traveling anywhere in the world. They began communicating with detectives in France through the former consul. Their concerns were finally alleviated when they received confirmation of Francisco's name and date of birth, which matched the information held by French authorities. It was discovered that Francisco had traveled around Europe before coming to the United States, where he was working as a truck driver. In March 2001, Francisco was arrested in Florida and identified as the main suspect in the murder of Caroline Dickinson, which occurred in France 5 years earlier. At this point, the young women who had been attacked in Miami recognized Francisco as the intruder who had broken into their dorm rooms, enabling the authorities to detain him. DNA from bodily fluids found on Caroline's body was sent to France for testing to confirm a match. This was a critical moment for European investigators and Caroline's parents. A few days later, the test results revealed an almost 100% match. Francisco Montes was extradited from the United States to France after 6 months, and it took another 2 years for him to confess to his crimes. He admitted to abusing a 13-year-old girl in France but claimed that Caroline Dickinson's death was accidental. Francisco argued that he had a mental illness, which he believed made him unaccountable for his actions. However, his attempt to avoid punishment due to insanity was unsuccessful. Experts concluded he was sane and capable of standing trial following several assessments. During the trial, he rarely spoke, mostly in Spanish, and appeared calm, showing no remorse for his actions. He was required to testify, and Francisco explained in French how the murder occurred. He stated that the defendant had traveled from Rennes to Plain Fougers with plans to return to England, where he was residing at the time. After getting lost, he sought a place to stay for the night and found the only building in the small village with its lights on, a youth hostel. He entered at night and saw that everyone was asleep. He began to check the rooms and noticed Caroline sleeping on the floor, whom he viewed as an easy target. Francisco approached her, covered her mouth with his hand, and then assaulted her. He ended up abusing her and accidentally killed her with a piece of cotton wool that suffocated her. Panicked, he fled the scene. During the trial, Francisco asked the victim's parents for forgiveness, acknowledging he knew the Dickinson family will never forgive him. The parents of Caroline, who were divorced at the time, along with their youngest daughter, attended the trial and provided testimony. They described their daughter as an innocent girl who wanted to explore the world and travel to different countries. This trip was a step towards fulfilling her dream. The parents had allowed Caroline to go on the trip without any concerns, believing that France was a safe place and that she would be supervised by her teachers. Caroline and her classmates were scheduled to visit various interesting sites. No one could have predicted the tragic outcome of this journey. Had they known, they would never have permitted their daughter to go. They did not forgive the criminal. During the trial, details about the defendant's life were uncovered. His mental health issues began in his teenage years when he started showing symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder. He was fixated on cleanliness, using a handkerchief to open doors and turn on lights, avoiding touching anything with his bare hands, meticulously washing everything with mineral water and soap multiple times. At the age of 20, Francisco started experiencing difficulties. After his friends learned about this, they sent him to a psychiatrist, who diagnosed him with depression and progressive schizophrenia. In the mid-1970s, he left Spain and traveled across Europe. He lived a transient lifestyle, working as a waiter, hotel doorman, or driver, but primarily relied on money from his father. An acquaintance noted that Francisco was very familiar with all the youth hostels in Europe and often sought the company of girls, particularly those aged 11 to 12, considering anyone over 20 to be too old for him. His friend also recalled a chilling admission from Francisco, where he expressed that he saw nothing wrong with killing a person. At one point, he had a girlfriend whom he physically abused. She bore him a son but eventually left him due to the violence. Afterward, he went on another trip where he continued to assault and abuse women. On June 14, 2004, Following a 3-week trial, Francisco Arce Montes was found guilty of murdering and abusing Caroline Dickinson. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The victim's parents felt a sense of relief, believing that their 8 years of waiting for justice and their activism had led to the conviction of their daughter's murderer. However, the situation did not end there. After 20 years, he filed an appeal but later withdrew it. Everyone was shocked by the long list of offenses, which took around 10 minutes to read. Over the 20 years before receiving a life sentence, he committed 4 abuses in Germany. South American authorities also believe he abused at least a dozen women within their borders, in addition to attacking many others. Additionally, there was one attempted abuse in France before Caroline's death. It's evident that the true extent of his crimes could have been much larger, but the trial only considered officially recorded cases where victims had reported to the police. Notably, all the other victims survived. Caroline may have been the only one who did not survive after being abused. U.S. detectives investigating his case believe he is linked to a series of abuses and murders in both the U.S. and Europe. His conviction has led to serious questions about why he was not apprehended sooner. He could have been arrested in Spain as early as autumn 1997, a year after Caroline's murder, yet he avoided capture. The lack of cooperation among law enforcement agencies across European countries hindered the process of transferring him to the French gendarmerie. The parents of the victim were troubled by this as well. Despite Francisco's conviction, the victim's mother and father continued to voice their frustration about the insufficient collaboration between international authorities, which allowed criminals to keep committing offenses without facing consequences. The parents of Caroline pushed for the establishment of an international DNA database to help address the situation. Throughout their advocacy, they frequently shared their daughter's story. This case highlighted the importance of collaboration among law enforcement agencies, even across different continents, in stopping dangerous criminals. Francisco's legal troubles continued after Caroline's case. The last people heard from Francisco in 2015, when he was convicted of abusing a young woman, a year after he had killed Caroline. He was extradited to Spain to face charges for the abuse of an 18-year-old girl. He deceived her into allowing him into her apartment building by pretending he had lost his keys. Once inside, he threatened her with a knife and abused her. For this crime, he was extradited and tried in Spain, where he was sentenced to 11 years in prison. He is expected to serve his jail time in Spain once he has been released from prison in France, where he is scheduled to stay until January 2027. Francisco has nearly run out of options for appealing his sentence. His earliest opportunity for release will be in 2038. However, it is improbable that he will live to see his 88th birthday while imprisoned. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Browning family. In 2008, Nicholas Browning turned 15. He was considered a kind-hearted teenager and a hard-working student. As the eldest child, he grew up in a family where his father, John Browning, was a respected attorney. John was also a Boy Scout leader and Sunday school teacher, earning admiration and recognition in the local community. Nicholas's mother, Tamara, was a kind and humble housewife, while his younger brothers, Benjamin and Greg, were well-loved members of the family. The Browning family lived in a house in Cockeysville, Maryland, a small town. Nicholas was an excellent student and a dedicated Boy Scout. While in high school, he was a tall and handsome young man, active on the golf and lacrosse teams, and admired as a role model. Many believed he had a bright future ahead of him. On the surface, the family seemed to be living a happy life, until tragedy struck. On the afternoon of February 2, 2008, Nicholas's parents drove him to a friend's house for a sleepover, where Nicholas and his friends planned to watch movies and play video games. The next morning, Nicholas and his friends needed to return home. Nicholas's parents had promised to pick him up in the morning, but they did not arrive on time. He tried calling them to find out what was going on, but no one answered. Frustrated, the teens decided to go to the mall with his friend's father. After shopping, they dropped Nicholas off at his home. During the trip, Nicholas repeatedly called and texted his parents, but there was still no response. When they arrived at his house, they noticed the family car parked in the driveway, but the house was strangely quiet. When Nicholas opened the door and walked in, he witnessed a horrifying scene. His entire family had been murdered. His father, John Browning, his mother, Tamara, and his two younger brothers, Greg and Benjamin, were all dead. A friend's father called 911 to report the incident, and the police arrived quickly at the scene. They found the teenagers in the yard, visibly shaken. Nicholas immediately claimed that a robbery had taken place. He explained that while he was staying overnight with friends, someone had broken into the house. He believed that the intruders' plans had been interrupted by his parents, and as a result, the robbers had killed the entire family. However, the crime scene shows another theory. There were no signs of a struggle, and police discovered 4 victims, each killed by a single gunshot to the head, in various parts of the house. A quick inspection of the property revealed no evidence of theft. Furniture was undamaged, and valuables in plain sight had not been disturbed. There were no signs of forced entry or any disturbance, leading the police to dismiss the idea of a botched robbery. Nicholas's account and behavior raised suspicions. Despite the teenagers' young age and the possibility of shock, all 4 boys were taken to the police station for questioning. To ensure that their statements could not be coordinated, they were separated into different rooms for individual questioning. During the interrogations, Nicholas's friends all gave the same account. They had spent the evening watching movies and playing video games until late, after which the group went to bed. They said they had not heard or seen anything unusual that night. The interview with Nicholas took place in a private room. The officer found Nicholas's behavior suspicious. When the officer entered the room, Nicholas was sitting quietly with his head down, appearing calm and even a little sleepy. An unusual reaction, considering that his entire family had just been murdered. The officer approached the conversation in a friendly manner, aiming to make it seem like a casual discussion with a witness. His goal was to gain Nicholas's trust so that he would answer truthfully. The officer hoped to secure a confession without a defense attorney present. Nicholas remained calm the interview. He explained that he had returned home from school at around 2:45 p.m. Shortly afterward, his parents decided to take him to a friend's house. Since the friend lived less than a kilometer away, they often walked to each other's houses. Nicholas told the same story as his friends, stating that they spent the evening playing video games and watching movies before going to bed. However, he admitted that he left his friend's house and went to his parents' house around midnight. His plan was to steal the family car and go out with his friends, making sure his parents didn't find out. When he got home, he noticed that the light was on in his parents' bedroom window. At that point, he climbed into the car. To avoid being seen, he lay down on the floor of the back seat. Nicholas was worried that the noise he made while opening the car door might alert his parents, but he didn't want to face his strict father's scolding. He decided to stay quiet and wait until the house was settled and everyone went back to bed. Nicholas claimed that he waited in the car and eventually fell asleep. It is possible that the shooting occurred during this time. Nicholas stated that he didn't hear anything and only woke up later before leaving. The forensic expert's report confirmed that the attack on the family occurred around midnight, killing everyone in the house. The family appeared to have been caught off guard. The first shot was fired at close range, killing the father, John, who was sleeping on the couch downstairs. Tamara and the 2 sons, who were sleeping upstairs, were also killed in their sleep. The police suspected that Nicholas might have been involved in the murder. His behavior raised suspicions, as he had withheld information from the police. It seemed odd that he chose to hide in the family car instead of immediately returning to his friend's house. Furthermore, Nicholas was the only survivor of the family and was home at the time of the murder. However, he claimed that he didn't hear anything, which further cast doubt on his testimony. Nicholas's claim that the lights were on in the house raised additional suspicions, as they were off when the police arrived at the scene. Considering his statement about the robbery, it was unclear why the robbers would leave the lights on during the robbery and then turn them off afterward. Typically, criminals do not waste time on such actions. Nicholas had no explanation for these inconsistencies. The police then spoke to Nicholas's friend, who stated that Nicholas was at his house in the evening, but was no longer there when he woke up around midnight. According to his statement, Nicholas had already left by that time. This created an inconsistency in the timeline, suggesting that the teens might not be telling the truth. Due to inconsistencies in their statements, the police returned to Nicholas's friend for clarification. Initially, the friend confirmed that Nicholas was no longer at the house around midnight. However, when the police pointed out the conflicting timelines provided by others, he quickly changed his story. He then stated that Nicholas was still at the house at midnight. Nicholas's friend appeared nervous and hesitant to tell the truth, possibly in an effort to protect his friend. After being calmed down by the police, the friend admitted that after Nicholas left, he went straight to bed. He also revealed that he knew Nicholas had planned to steal his parents' car, but did not expect him to get stuck in the car or harm his family. The police then spoke to Nicholas again and shared new statements from his friends. This time, Nicholas claimed that he had left his friend's house and returned home to get his car later, at around 1 a.m. He changed his story again, stating that the lights were on when he arrived, but were off when he woke up. He assumed this meant that the robbers had entered the house while he was there. Nicholas still insisted that he had fallen asleep in his car. But how could he have slept after hearing 4 gunshots? This time, Nicholas said he had woken up at around 5 a.m. when his friend called him. Instead of returning to his parents' house, he went back to his friend's house without his car. Although Nicholas was increasingly under suspicion, he tried to remain calm. At times, he even laughed and joked during conversations, which the police interpreted as an attempt to mislead them. Nicholas appeared innocent, but the police believed there was something much more sinister behind his facade. When Nicholas eventually returned home with his friends, they entered the house through the garage. Nicholas invited his friends inside, which seemed unusual. Once inside, Nicholas pointed out that the garage door was open, which he found strange since his family always kept it closed. According to his friend's father, Nicholas repeatedly emphasized this to everyone present before they entered. As they walked through the living room, Nicholas led the way. He was the first to see his father lying on the couch, covered in blood. Shocked, Nicholas shouted to the others. His friend saw the body but immediately ran outside, refusing to go any further. During questioning, Nicholas confirmed all of these details. What worried the police most was the calm, emotionless way he spoke about everything, which was highly unusual for someone grieving the loss of a family member. When this story became public, people were shocked and tried to understand what had happened to Nicholas's family. Later, in his defense, Nicholas admitted that the car keys had been in his coat pocket the entire time. He remembered them when he visited his friend's house, and that was when he hatched the plan to steal the family car. The police were puzzled as to why he had not revealed this information earlier. They believed he was hiding something and lying again. Nicholas's friend stated that Nicholas had called home and asked his younger brother to leave the back door open, although the reason for this request was unclear. After this revelation, however, the police became certain that Nicholas had committed the murder of his family. He also told the police that his father owned 2 guns and had taken him hunting many times, so he was familiar with using them. Nicholas's friends revealed that he frequently had conflicts with his father, who had caught him drinking on multiple occasions. However, Nicholas claimed that a man who lived near his family was capable of such a brutal crime. He was referring to a neighbor who was a drug user and had a history of legal trouble. The police, however, believed this was an attempt to shift blame and divert suspicion from himself. There was no evidence against the neighbor, and he had a solid alibi. When the police publicly identified Nicholas as the prime suspect, he appeared very nervous and insisted that he was innocent. He later claimed that his parents were extremely cruel and that he had suffered years of mental and physical abuse at their hands. During questioning, Nicholas repeatedly asked the police if he could be treated in a psychiatric hospital instead of receiving a life sentence. The police did not give a clear answer to this question. However, the Nicholas's suspicious interest played against him. Nicholas clearly realized his guilt and hopefully reduced the severity of the punishment. By the end of the interrogation, there was sufficient evidence against Nicholas, but his motives remained unclear. According to his friends, Nicholas had argued with his father shortly before the murder. He later recounted several instances in which his father had treated him harshly, even resorting to violence. Nicholas mentioned that their relationship had significantly worsened during the fall. It seems that the challenges of adolescence had a major negative impact on his behavior. His father, known for being strict, had tried to discipline and correct his son's behavior. According to Nicholas's testimony, on the day of the incident, he went to visit friends after his father had spanked him that morning for reasons Nicholas considered unreasonable. Police suspect that the punishment stemmed from the teenager's refusal to obey his parents. Friends' testimonies indicated that Nicholas, like many teenagers, had started to rebel. Tensions with his father were especially high after Nicholas was caught drinking on multiple occasions. Nicholas explained that he drank as a way to cope with his problems. Some relatives supported this claim, describing his father as a stern man. In interviews with Nicholas's classmates and close circle, police learned that the circumstances leading up to the massacre had been developing long before the actual event. However, it remains unclear why he killed his mother and younger brothers, who had not harmed him. Many classmates recalled him sharing stories about how he could no longer handle the abuse and emotional pressure from his father. While many described Nicholas as a hard-working and calm, kind student, his closest friends were aware of his darker side. Outside of school, he often beat his younger brothers, stole alcohol from his father's bar, and even took the family car without permission. Nicholas displayed troubling behavior, frequently bullying younger students and those with disabilities. Nicholas eventually broke down and confessed to killing his parents and younger brothers, though his explanation was both strange and disturbing. He claimed that during a sleepover with friends, he had returned home, sneaked in, and found his father asleep on the couch. Nicholas took a gun, contemplated his actions for about half an hour, and then decided to go through with it. He shot his father, and since everyone in the house was asleep, no one heard the gunshots. However, he did not stop there. After killing his father, he went upstairs and killed his mother before entering younger brother's room, where he also killed both of them. Nicholas admitted he killed younger brothers because they would have called the police. He explained that he had asked one of younger brothers to leave the door unlocked the day before, suggesting the murders may have been premeditated. Nicholas claimed he shot his family members in the head to ensure they would not suffer lasting pain. He then led police to the location of the murder weapon, which he had hidden in bushes on his family's property. Ballistic tests confirmed the weapon was used in the murders, and DNA evidence matching Nicholas's was found on the gun's barrel. He was eventually formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Many people viewed Nicholas positively, so much so that after his arrest, the court received several letters pleading for leniency. One of these letters came from his grandfather, who claimed that Nicholas had endured years of physical and mental abuse from his father. Some people found it hard to believe that Nicholas could be guilty. While awaiting trial just 2 days before it began, Nicholas was in prison and made a phone call to a friend. Their conversation, which was recorded, included Nicholas joking about escaping. This behavior indicated that he felt no remorse and did not grasp the seriousness of his actions. However, during the trial, the mood changed dramatically. At one point, Nicholas burst into tears and apologized to his relatives, expressing deep remorse. The prosecution used this moment to portray him as manipulative, citing it as evidence of his two-faced nature. On the other hand, The defense argued that such a seemingly upright young man could not be a cold-blooded killer. These conflicting portrayals became a central focus of the trial. The prosecution highlighted Nicholas's darker side, supported by testimony from numerous witnesses, while the defense emphasized his positive qualities, including his involvement in the Boy Scouts and his excellent academic record. During the hearing, Nicholas became so emotional that he was unable to read his apology speech, leaving his attorney to read it for him. The defense's claim that Nicholas was insane was quickly dismissed. During interviews with the police, he had shown no signs of mental illness. Furthermore, he had no history of mental health problems or disorders. Despite this, his attorney pushed for Nicholas to be sent to a psychiatric facility that provided rehabilitation programs for juvenile offenders. The defense argued that Nicholas's motive for the crime was unconvincing. If it had been for money, he would not have been able to access it until adulthood. Killing his family would have only worsened his circumstances, potentially placing him in an orphanage or foster care. This suggested that Nicholas did not fully understand the consequences of his actions. A psychiatric evaluation was conducted, which concluded that Nicholas was mentally fit to stand trial. This ruled out the use of mental health as a defense. Since crimes like this are punishable by death under state law, Nicholas faced serious consequences. However, due to his age, he was not eligible for the death penalty. In January 2009, Nicholas finally reached a plea agreement with the prosecution. Nicholas Browning pleaded guilty to all charges, and a jury sentenced him to 4 life terms. He is currently incarcerated at a correctional facility in Cumberland, Maryland. In 2014, he requested that his sentence be reconsidered, but his request was denied. In Maryland, granting a pardon for a life sentence requires the governor's approval, which has not occurred in the state since 1994. This makes it unlikely that Nicholas will ever be released. Let's head over to the small, quiet town of Malang in North Cotabato, Philippines. It's a place known for its calm vibe and rural charm, where life moves at a slower pace. The people here are deeply connected to the land, relying on agriculture for their livelihood. In this peaceful town lived the Magwad family. Unlike many others, they led a pretty stable life. Cruz Magwad, the father, was an elementary school teacher who was well respected and loved by everyone, often being praised for his hard work. His wife, Lovella, was the principal at the same school. Together, while they didn't make a lot of money, they were considered one of the more privileged families in town. Their youngest child, Criziel Lewis, was 16 years old. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer even at such a young age and was determined to work hard to achieve that goal. Besides being intelligent, he was also creative, playing guitar, drawing, and reading in his spare time. His older sister, Criziel Gwyn, was the more intense one, super smart, driven, and goal-oriented. She had always been that way as a kid, being a Girl Scout with a sash covered in so many badges that there was no room for more. Gwyn didn't stop there. She enrolled in a pre-med program during high school and planned to become a doctor. By all accounts, Gwyn was the type of person who would sit with you at a party if you were feeling shy, sticking by your side until you felt at ease. That's how she met 17-year-old Janice Sebiel. However, unlike Gwyn and Lewis, Janice's childhood was far from happy. She wasn't privileged enough to attend school and had to work from a very young age. Even worse, she grew up without parents. Her first real memories began around the age of 8. Before that, everything was a blur. She only recalls being found by a stranger wandering alone on a huge shipping container boat. Her parents were nowhere to be found, and Janice believed they had abandoned her. A stranger was kind enough to post her picture and name online in an attempt to find her parents. They shared her story on Facebook and various online forums, but no one ever came forward. Eventually, Janice was dropped off at the Philippine version of Child Protective Services, the Department of Social Welfare and Development, where she moved from one foster home to another. Not long after, Janice was offered a live-in nanny job by a family. Though she hated the job, she was incredibly grateful for the opportunity. Janice shared all of this with Gwyn, and Gwyn was so deeply moved by her story that an idea began to form in her mind, an idea that could give Janice the safe, loving home she deserved: adoption. Together with Lewis, Gwyn decided to present this idea to their parents. Like a well-thought-out thesis, they approached the subject with serious dedication, explaining that adopting Janice wouldn't just change her life, it would help their family too. They convinced their parents that Janice could pitch in with the chores around the house, which was a significant consideration in their Asian family culture. It wasn't uncommon for children to share the responsibility of washing dishes, cleaning, and cooking. With one more set of hands to help, the family would run more smoothly. Gwyn's parents weren't exactly rolling in money, but they believed in teaching responsibility. The kids had chores, had to keep their grades up, and attended church every Sunday. They were strict, but it was out of love. Gwyn and Lewis respected that. In 2021, Janice moved in, and it was like she was instantly part of the family. The Magwad welcomed her with open arms. Lewis even gave up his own room so Janice could have a more comfortable one. They enrolled her in school right away, and for the first time, Janice didn't have to wake up with the constant worry of finding food or going to work. She was finally allowed to be a kid. As Janice settled into her new life, the bond between the three siblings grew stronger by the day. We could see the happiness shining through, especially in the videos they posted on TikTok. Janice even got to experience a family vacation for the first time, something she had always dreamed of. Laughter filled the air as they explored new places together, creating memories she would cherish forever. For once, Janice felt like she belonged to something bigger, something safe and full of love. But just when everything seemed perfect, Janice's world was about to shatter. On December 10th of that same year, she posted a series of statuses on Facebook claiming that she and her siblings were under attack. It was just days before Christmas, a time that should have been filled with joy. Instead, it marked the beginning of a nightmare. At that time, Mr. Cruz, their father, was at school doing some chores related to the upcoming holiday, while Lovella, their mother, was away on a work trip. Everything changed when Mr. Cruz received a phone call that left him frozen in terror. The voice on the other end told him that their home was being ransacked, and his children were inside. By 3:15 in the afternoon, Cruz finally arrived at the house. It was eerily silent outside the front door. His eyes locked onto a blood-soaked blanket on the ground with a knife nearby. He called out for his kids, but there was no response. He moved quickly to the back door and managed to find a way inside. Cruz moved rapidly through the house, his voice echoing off the walls as he searched for his children. When he entered the living room, that a horrifying sight met his eyes. There, lying on the floor, was his daughter Gwyn. A towel soaked in blood was wrapped around her body, her limbs and torso were covered in multiple slash wounds. But it was the injuries on her neck that were particularly severe. Crime scene photos later revealed the gruesome extent of the wounds. Her flesh was torn apart, and ants had already begun to gather on her body. Not far from Gwyn, near the main door, Cruz found Lewis. His hands and feet were bound, and a gag covered his mouth. His body was riddled with fresh stab wounds, and the amount of blood suggested that the attack had happened just moments before Cruz arrived. But there was one more person missing. Janice's heart pounded as Cruz continued to search the house, calling her name. Finally, Janice appeared. She emerged from her room, her hair wet and her face pale and shaken. She was in shock, barely able to speak. Seeing her, Cruz immediately called the police. The officers arrived soon after, stepping into a crime scene that would later be described as one of the most gruesome in the Philippines. Blood pooled on the floor, and the house bore the marks of extreme violence. Janice, while trembling, told the officers that they had been attacked. The house was in disarray, cabinets had been pried open and personal belongings were scattered across the rooms. At first glance, it seemed like a robbery. However, investigators knew that appearances could be deceiving. They needed to confirm whether anything valuable had been taken to solidify the robbery theory. At the same time, as part of their protocol, the police did not rule out the parents as persons of interest. The police needed to confirm their alibis and whereabouts during the attack. The investigators turned their attention to the room where Janice said she was hiding during the attack. It was messy, but that wasn't unusual for a robbery scene. What stood out, though, were the details that didn't add up. The disarray in the room, though chaotic, didn't have the usual signs of a real robbery. So the police began to search the house more carefully, and they soon found some crucial evidence just outside the front door. The police discovered a blood-stained shirt, which they believed had been dropped by the attacker while trying to escape. About 100 meters away, they found a plastic bag in a ditch. Inside were bloody pants and underwear. It seemed the attacker had deliberately discarded these items to hide evidence. Inside the house, the scene became increasingly horrifying. The living room floor was littered with shards of glass and broken bottles, a clear sign of the violence that had unfolded there. Expansive pools of blood reveal the brutal nature of the attack. Among the carnage, investigators discovered a discarded knife, a baseball bat, and a hammer, each stained with blood. These weapons were assumed to have been used in the murders. Crime scene analysts took careful note of the blood patterns, which provided key insights into the sequence of events. They determined that Gwen, the older sibling, had likely been killed first. Her blood had partially coagulated and rigor mortis had already begun to set in. In contrast, Lewis's blood appeared much fresher, suggesting he had been murdered after Gwen. The different states of the blood and bodies made this theory even more plausible. Lewis's hands and feet were bound, while Gwen's were not. This discrepancy indicated that Gwen might have been ambushed and killed quickly, while Lewis was restrained, likely to prevent him from resisting before his own murder. The fact that so many different tools were used and that the victims had distinctive types of wounds strongly suggested the involvement of more than one attacker. This theory was supported by the fact that Lewis had been restrained. It would have been difficult for a single person to control a victim while also carrying out such a brutal attack. Adding to the mystery, crews confirmed that the weapons found at the scene were his. The murderers seemed to have used tools that were readily available in the house, which made the crime even more unsettling. As investigators continued to gather evidence, they found something that stood out. The family's laundry machine had been used, but there were no freshly washed clothes anywhere in the house. This odd discovery suggested that something unusual had happened after the crime, perhaps an attempt to erase evidence or cover their tracks. The extreme brutality of the crime prompted local authorities to launch a manhunt for the suspects. The public was shocked, and the need for justice became urgent. To help with the investigation, the vice of the Municipal Council of Mlang, North Cotabato announced a reward of 200,000 pesos for any information leading to the capture of the perpetrators. The mayor also offered an additional 50,000 pesos as a bounty. These actions emphasized the gravity of the case and the community's desperate need for answers. Autopsies were performed on Gwen and Lewis over 2 days, starting on December 13, 2021, and the results were chilling. Gwen had sustained 32 stab and slash wounds, some of which were deep enough to almost sever her limbs. One of her ears had been cut off, and her neck and upper arm were nearly severed. Her body also showed signs of blunt force trauma, likely caused by the hammer and baseball bat found at the scene. Additionally, the backs of her hands were bruised, covered in defensive wounds, indicating that she had fought fiercely. Meanwhile, Lewis had endured 51 knife wounds, some so deep that they exposed his bones and internal organs. Red marks on his neck suggested he may have been strangled. Unlike his sister, Lewis had no defensive wounds. He also had signs of blunt force trauma on his limbs and torso. All these injuries were consistent with the weapons recovered at the scene. Investigators quickly ruled out the possibility of a robbery gone wrong. Though the rooms appeared ransacked, only Gwen's phone was missing. Nothing else of value had been taken, leading authorities to believe that the killer or killers were familiar with the victims. It was also striking that the crime took place in broad daylight, which made the entire situation even more unsettling. Before the autopsy results were made public, rumors began circulating online accusing Janice of being involved in the crime. These rumors gained traction due to her survival, the weapons being from the family home, and the locked front door. The accusations grew increasingly intense, with some even threatening Janice. Under the mounting pressure, the police decided to question her. Janice described the events of that day. She had been studying with Gwyn in her bedroom while Lewis was downstairs in the living room. Suddenly, they heard screams, and 3 men broke into the house. The 2 girls rushed downstairs and saw the 3 men attacking Lewis with the weapons found at the scene. The attackers then turned on Gwyn. In fear, Janice fled upstairs, locked herself in her bedroom, and hid under the bed. Janice was too scared to call the police, so instead, she texted the family group chat asking for help. Later, she messaged her adoptive mom saying, "Mom, help." When no one saw those messages, Janice went a step further and posted on social media, saying, "Help. Somebody has broken into the house. I don't want to die. I'm hiding in my room. Help." After a few minutes, she deleted the post, worried the attackers might see it and come after her. By the time someone saw the post and reached out to her mom, Janice was too scared to pick up. She even changed her social media username and put her phone on silent, clearly trying to hide. When the house finally fell silent, Janice emerged from her hiding place, too afraid to go downstairs. She claimed she took a shower and changed clothes to calm herself, finishing just as Cruz arrived home. However, there was something odd about this part of the story. Janice had told the police she locked herself in her bedroom the moment the attack began, so why did her room look like it had been ransacked? That raised serious questions. More importantly, Janice's version of events was directly at odds with the forensic evidence. The autopsy results and the way the injuries were distributed made it clear that Gwyn was the first victim, not Lewis. This major discrepancy between Janice's account and the evidence made investigators even more suspicious. Something wasn't adding up, and they started to take a closer look at Janice's statements. At first, she told the police her phone was off during the attack, but Cruz remembered calling her phone and hearing it ring with no answer. When Janice was confronted with this, she changed her story again, now claiming that she had been in the shower and hadn't heard her phone ringing. This was starting to sound suspicious. But that wasn't the only thing that raised eyebrows. Cruz also revealed some information about the murder weapons that added fuel to the fire. The baseball bat used in the attack originally belonged to Lewis. He had kept it in his room on the top bunk as a kind of protection. However, after being adopted by Cruz, Janice had taken over the top bunk. The hammer used in the attack was another tool that Cruz kept around for home repairs. He was very careful about where he stored it, usually hiding it behind the washing machine. Cruz mentioned that only 3 people knew exactly where that hammer was: himself, Gwyn, and Janice. This meant that the killer or killers had to have known the family's routines and possessions very well, almost as if they had been living in the house with them. Things became even more suspicious when a delivery driver came forward. The driver had arrived at the house just 18 minutes before Cruz was contacted by a neighbor who noticed that no one had answered the door. The driver kept calling out, hoping someone would respond. Eventually, he noticed a woman peering at him through a door before she suddenly walked away. The woman's identity was never confirmed, but it raised serious doubts about where Janice was and what she was doing during the attack. At the crime scene, it had been locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. This was significant because it meant that whoever had done this was likely someone familiar with the house, someone who had access to a key and could lock the door after the crime. At this point, it was pretty clear that Janice had something to do with the murders. However, since Janice was only 17 years old, still a minor. Under Philippine law, the police couldn't arrest her without solid proof. This legal issue made them tread carefully, as they couldn't move forward with an arrest until they had more definitive evidence. Rather than arresting her immediately, the authorities placed Janice under the care of the Social Welfare Department while they investigated who had actually committed the murders. If Janice's claim about other people being involved was true, the police had a considerable amount of work ahead of them. 5 days after the murders, a significant breakthrough occurred. The police discovered Janice's fingerprints on the murder weapons. This was a huge deal, but it wasn't the smoking gun. After all, Janice had lived in the house where the weapons were stored, so her prints could have been there simply from handling them. Still, it was a lead they couldn't ignore. To ensure she wasn't treated unfairly, Janice was given a lawyer by the Social Welfare Department. However, things took another unexpected turn when Lovella, Janice's adoptive mother, found a contact tracing form while searching Janice's room for clues. To her surprise, it wasn't Janice's form, it belonged to a 17-year-old boy named Esmeraldo Aldo Cano Jr. Aldo was a sacristan at a local church, and Janice had known him from the orphanage. This discovery sent the police scrambling to determine if Aldo had anything to do with the murders. Soon enough, witnesses came forward confirming that Aldo had been near the crime scene on the day of the killings. One woman stated she saw Aldo drop Janice off near the house right before the murders, and another neighbor said she saw him asking for directions to the house that morning. When shown a picture of Aldo, the woman immediately recognized him. Then, on December 16th, 6 days after the murder, Janice, with her lawyer present, gave a full confession. She admitted to being involved in the murders along with Aldo. Janice explained that her motive stemmed from deep resentment and jealousy. She felt that Gwyn and Lewis were receiving all the love and attention from their parents. In her mind, they were standing in the way of her getting the affection she had longed for. She even confessed that killing them would leave her as the only child in the family, guaranteeing that she would get all the love and attention she had recently started receiving after being adopted. Janice revealed that her ultimate goal was to take Gwyn's place in the family, driven by years of emotional neglect in the orphanage where she had grown up. By December 18th, Janice's confession was officially recorded, although it was inconsistent, much like many of her previous statements. The police tracked down Aldo, who voluntarily surrendered, admitting his role as well. Forensic analysis later confirmed that blood found on discarded clothing in a ditch belonged to Aldo. Like Janice, Aldo was also a minor, so he was placed under the care of the Social Welfare Department. Later that same day, in an unrelated banned substance raid, police arrested a 17-year-old for possession of illegal substances. When they searched his phone, they found something that tied him to the case: Gwyn's stolen cell phone. The serial number confirmed it had been taken after the murders. The police pieced it together. Janice had enlisted Aldo to sell the phone because she couldn't get rid of it herself. Unfortunately, the phone had been damaged, making it impossible to retrieve any useful data. The boy who had the phone wasn't involved in the murders, he had simply bought it from Aldo. Because Janice and Aldo were minors, the police couldn't release any juicy details about their confessions to the public, despite the parents pressing for information. As the investigation progressed, Janice stopped cooperating, making it even harder to figure out exactly what had happened. Some people believe Janice's confessions weren't even the full story. Whispers circulated that the murders were even worse than she had let on, like the possibility that Lewis was tied up and forced to watch as his sister was murdered before he was killed as well. After the shocking confessions, Lovella, the siblings' mother, was interviewed and reflected on the warning signs she had missed. According to Lovella, they had adopted Janice 5 months before the murders. At first, everything seemed fine, the family welcomed her, and she appeared grateful. However, soon small red flags began to show. In August 2021, when Gwyn's parents were hospitalized, Cruz noticed that 10,000 pesos, about $170, set aside for emergencies was missing. Janice claimed thieves had taken it, but the next day a large sum was found hidden in her school bag. After some questioning, Janice admitted she had taken the money. Despite this breach of trust, the family, particularly Gwyn, chose to forgive her. They were sympathetic to her troubled past, attributing the theft to the survival instinct she had developed after years of hardship. Janice apologized, and the family, hoping this was a one-time mistake. They accepted her apology, believing the worst was behind them. However, as months passed, Janice's behavior started to shift in unsettling ways. She became lazy, irresponsible, neglecting household chores and showing a disregard for reminders. She apologized but never followed through. Although troubling, it didn't raise any immediate alarms until the morning of the murders. On that day, Janice did something she had never done before. She called Cruz and Lovella mom and dad for the first time. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a red flag, indicating a deeper, darker shift in her emotional state. It was as if something had clicked in her mind, setting in motion what was about to happen. As the investigation unfolded, more shocking truths came to light. Janice had lied about her origins from the start. Her story of being an orphan was a fabrication. Her parents were alive and had spent years desperately searching for her. When the case went viral, Filipino amateur sleuths dug into her past and uncovered a nearly decade-old missing persons notice. Her parents weren't very active on Facebook back then, so they missed the post. Fast forward to the murders, and that same post started circulating online again. It didn't take long for Janice's biological parents to recognize her. Born in 2005, Janice was the youngest of 3 children, but her childhood was filled with chaos. Her father's gambling addiction tore the family apart, and after remarrying, her mother tried to make the best of the situation by dividing what little they had left among her children. Eventually, Janice and her siblings were placed in different orphanages. By 2020, Janice had actually reunited with her biological family, but that reunion didn't last long. Her relatives later claimed she cut them off, saying they were too poor to be of any use to her. This betrayal shocked everyone. Things took a darker turn when Janice's biological mother, devastated by what her daughter had done, attended the funeral of Gwyn and Lewis. In her grief, she kept apologizing, overwhelmed with guilt about her daughter's actions. In one heartbreaking moment, Janice's biological mother even knelt down, but the Magwad weren't seeking revenge. They made it clear that they weren't angry, only seeking justice. They insisted that Janice's biological mother encourage her daughter to confess. Janice's mother tried to visit Janice at the social welfare office, but Janice refused to see her, citing strict rules. Then, the investigation took a jaw-dropping turn when evidence surfaced suggesting the murders were premeditated. Screenshots of a conversation between Janice and an unknown person went viral. In the messages, Janice confessed that she wanted to kill her siblings, thinking their deaths would give her the freedom she craved. She even wondered if anyone would still accept her if she committed murder, expressing a chilling belief that no matter what she did, God would forgive her if she asked. Some sources claim that Janice often talked about the 2009 horror movie The Orphan, a film about a young girl adopted by a family who ultimately betrays and kills them. She even posted on Facebook that she loved the movie and watched it repeatedly. When Janice's trial began, her behavior was just as disturbing. She was seen smiling and laughing in court, showing no remorse or regret. Cruz and Lovella, devastated by the loss of their children, said in interviews that they might have forgiven Janice if she had shown even a hint of genuine remorse, but her coldness only deepened their pain. The case became a national sensation in the Philippines. From March 2022, when Janice and Esmeralda were officially charged with murder, to their conviction on May 17, 2022, the case was closely followed by the public. Janice Sibiel was sentenced to 31 years in prison, while Esmeralda Aldo Cano Jr. received a 29-year sentence. However, both sentences came with one condition: they would serve them under the supervision of the Department of Social Welfare and Development until their 21st birthdays, after which they would be transferred to adult prisons. Gwyn and Lewis's parents had mixed feelings about the trial's outcome. While they recognized that the courts handed down the toughest punishment possible under the law, they felt the laws were too soft. The biggest issue, however, was Janice's complete lack of remorse. Cruz and Lovella were outspoken against Republic Act 9344, which limits the legal accountability of minors. According to this law, the minimum age for criminal liability is 15, and individuals between the ages of 15 and 18 can be held accountable but are sent to youth centers or rehab programs instead of adult prisons. This law prevents minors like Janice from being tried as adults, even for heinous crimes. Many argued that kids shouldn't be capable of planning or committing such brutal acts. In the US and other countries, minors committing these kinds of crimes would have been tried as adults. Cruz and Lovella felt strongly that Janice's age shouldn't excuse her from taking full responsibility, especially for such a violent and premeditated crime. This view was shared by many who felt the law was too lenient in cases like this. They publicly called for changes to the law, wanting those who commit violent acts at a young age to be held fully accountable. Some of the most heartbreaking facts to come out of the investigation revealed that Gwen almost escaped. She had the chance to run, but when she heard Lewis calling for help, she went back, hoping to save her brother. The Jacobson family seemed to have it all: wealth, success, and a beautiful home in Wellington, Florida. They appeared to be the ideal loving family. However, appearances can be misleading. Behind the facade of their perfect life lay a much darker reality. What was meant to be a joyful birthday celebration for their two young boys turned into a devastating event, leading to a tragedy so profound that the entire nation would remember their names. To fully grasp this story, we need to go back to 1989 when Neil Jacobson met Frankie at a gym in Bayside, Queens, New York, where they both lived and worked. They are ambitious and successful in their careers. Frankie was making her mark at Lehman Brothers, a leading firm in finance, while Neil had established his own boutique firm on Long Island. They were young, driven, and aspiring to achieve the American dream. Those who knew them praised their relationship as one filled with deep admiration and affection. Frankie was entirely devoted to Neil. In turn, he was seen as a charismatic and kind man with immense potential. Within his family and social circles, he was often regarded as a golden boy, intelligent, charming, and seemingly unstoppable. Together, Neil and Frankie appeared to be the perfect couple. They soon took the next step in their relationship by getting married and moving into Neil's home in New Jersey. Transitioning into married life was easy for them. Together, they created a comfortable, rewarding life filled with shared interests and adventures. They did everything, enjoying activities like biking, scuba diving, and weekend trips to the countryside, which helped strengthen their bond. To an outside observer, their life seemed perfect. However, amidst their seemingly ideal marriage, they felt something was missing: children. They desperately wanted to start a family, but the path to parenthood was challenging. For years, they endured the painful reality of infertility, going through multiple fertility treatments that brought both hope and disappointment. Despite the emotional toll, they remained determined. Finally, in 2003, after many struggles, their dreams came true when they welcomed twin boys, Joshua and Eric. With their lives already comfortable, Frankie and Neil experienced happiness beyond what they had ever imagined. Their family felt complete, and they thrived both personally and professionally. Neil's parents, Harold and Goldie Jacobson, moved from New Jersey to Florida in 2000. Although they loved their new home, they missed being close to their son and his family. They often expressed their frustration about the distance and wished for more time with their grandchildren. In 2005, Harold was diagnosed with cancer, and his health deteriorated rapidly, making it impossible for him to travel to New Jersey. This situation was a turning point for Neil. Being far from his father during such a critical time was too much to bear. He decided to move his family to Florida to be closer to his parents. Before the move, Neil had already started investing in real estate in Florida. He bought a pre-construction condo in Lantana and then a second one shortly after. Real estate quickly became an obsession for him, leading to the purchase of a third condo. Despite recognizing that he was stretching himself financially, he was drawn in by the booming market. Frankie, however, was concerned about his investments and questioned their practicality. Nonetheless, Neil was resolute in his decision and was not willing to change his plans. With his properties piling up in Florida, Neil began pushing Frankie to relocate. She was resistant, hesitant to leave behind the life they had built in New Jersey. She loved their home, their community, and the stability they had created. But as time passed, the financial strain of maintaining their New Jersey home became overwhelming. Eventually, Frankie reluctantly agreed to the move. The Jacobsons officially settled in Florida, eager to start a new chapter close to family. However, things did not go as planned. Neil had hoped to sell their New Jersey home before the move, but the market wasn't in his favor. Just 2 months after they arrived in Florida, tragedy struck. Harold Jacobson passed away. The loss of his father devastated Neil in ways he hadn't expected. He had uprooted his entire life to be closer to Harold, only to lose him so soon after arriving. The grief weighed heavily on him, and his mother, Goldie, later revealed that Neil had struggled with his mental health from a young age. She recalled that as a teenager, he had been diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder, an issue that had plagued him for years. Doctors had noted that Neil had an overwhelming desire to be the perfect child, a pressure that followed him into adulthood. As the years passed, his struggles with anxiety only grew, and soon, things took an even darker turn. The Great Recession hit Florida hard, and Neil, who worked as a mortgage broker. The real estate market collapsed, and the once thriving business that had allowed him to invest so freely was now crumbling beneath him. The financial security he had worked so hard to build was slipping away. As the weight of his losses grew heavier, so did the cracks in his once stable world. The Florida condos he had invested in before relocating were quickly turning into a financial nightmare. Burdened with subprime mortgages, their payments increased month after month, stretching his resources thin. At first, Neil had convinced himself that things would turn around. He had always been a problem solver, always finding ways to make things work. But this time, no amount of determination could keep the walls from closing in. With little to no work coming in, and 4 separate mortgages draining their finances. At first, Neil and Frankie tried to hold on, dipping into their savings to stay afloat. But as time passed, their financial situation only worsened. Bills piled up, debt collectors began calling, and the stress of trying to keep everything together was pushing Neil to his limits. Desperate for a solution, he started making risky financial decisions, one bad choice after another, each one digging them deeper into a hole. He chased after risky investments, sought out loans, all in a futile attempt to stop the inevitable collapse. Eventually, the weight of it all became too much to bear. The financial juggling act had run its course. Frankie was exhausted and drained, made the painful decision to stop paying the mortgages on their 3 Florida condos. It was a move that felt like surrender, but they had no choice. There was simply no more money left to give. By the year 2008, the pressure of Neil's business failures had begun to take a serious toll on his health. At first, it started with minor complaints, aches and pains that he couldn't quite explain, but as time went on, his symptoms worsened. He became sluggish, struggling to muster the energy for even the most basic tasks. His body felt heavy, and his mind clouded. He experienced random bouts of dizziness that left him feeling unstable, and he found himself unable to focus the way he used to. Concerned, he visited the family doctor, who ordered a blood test. In October, the results were troubling. Neil had elevated hormone levels, but there was no immediate explanation for his decline. As the weeks passed, his condition only worsened. The once energetic and determined man was now lethargic, withdrawn, barely functioning. He was eventually diagnosed with depression and transient peripheral vertigo, a condition that further contributed to his constant dizziness. In an attempt to help him cope, his doctor prescribed Zoloft, a common antidepressant. Neil, desperate to feel better, took the medication as prescribed, hoping it would offer some relief. But instead of improving, his mental state deteriorated further. A few days after starting Zoloft, he was called back to the doctor's office, where they added a prescription for Xanax. It was meant to ease his anxiety, but his family and friends quickly noticed that something wasn't right. Instead of stabilizing his mood, the medication seemed to send him spiraling even further into darkness. His paranoia intensified, his emotions became more erratic, and Neil they had once known began to fade before their eyes. Neil's sister, Deborah, became deeply concerned about her brother's rapid decline. She confided in their mother, worried about what he was going through. According to Deborah, Neil had started experiencing terrifying hallucinations. He had grown increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone or something was out to get him. Frankie, his wife, was just as alarmed. She desperate for support as Neil's behavior became more and more disturbing. He had completely withdrawn from the world, he refused to go outside, stopped engaging with friends and family, and even neglected his own hygiene. There were days when he wouldn't even shower, lost in a haze of fear and depression. His paranoia took a terrifying turn when he became obsessed with the idea that the FBI was watching him. He was convinced that federal agents were surveilling him, gathering evidence to have him arrested. He would talk about it constantly, warning anyone who would listen that they were building a case against him. His delusions became more elaborate. He was certain that his phone was tapped, that his home was under surveillance, and that at any moment, the authorities would storm in, take him away. His mother saw the full extent of his paranoia. One of the last times she visited him, Neil pulled her aside, his voice shaking with fear. He told her he was in big trouble, insisting that the FBI was coming for him, that he had done something terrible, though he couldn't seem to explain exactly what. The fear in his eyes was real, raw, and overwhelming. As Neil's mind unraveled, January 23, 2010. The darkness he had been wrestling with for months finally took over, and what happened next would shock everyone who had ever known him. That morning, Neil stood before his wardrobe, fumbling with the top shelf, his hands shaking as he retrieved a loaded gun. His wife, Frankie, still groggy from sleep, watched in confusion, not yet realizing the horror that was unfolding before her. Neil, with the gun in hand, stepped out of the wardrobe, his face hardening into something almost unrecognizable. Frankie's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. In an instant, panic took over. She leapt toward him, struggling desperately to wrest the weapon from his grasp. They tumbled to the floor, the fight becoming a chaotic blur of screams, desperation, and tears. In the midst of the struggle, Neil, in a violent frenzy, struck Frankie, knocking out her front tooth and slicing her finger. Despite the brutality of it all, Frankie didn't give up. She fought with all her strength, but Neil was too much, overpowering her in his disturbed state. With cold detachment, he stood, reloaded the gun, and turned the weapon on her. 2 shots rang out one after another, each striking her in the face, silencing her forever. But Neil's twisted path didn't end there, covered in Frankie's blood. He reloaded the gun and made his way to his son Eric's room. Eric, who had been lying on his stomach in peaceful sleep, was the next victim in the nightmare that Neil had somehow constructed in his mind. 2 bullets tore through Eric's body, but against all odds, the boy survived the first 2 shots. However, Neil was undeterred, his mind fixated on finishing what he had started. He grabbed a pillow and pressed it over Eric's face, ensuring his son wouldn't survive. 2 more shots, and Eric was gone. The house was eerily still now as Neil moved toward the next room, where his youngest son Joshua was sleeping. Joshua, blissfully unaware of the carnage around him, lay curled in his sheets. Neil's actions were methodical, almost as if he were following a script. He covered his son's face with a pillow, silencing him with 2 shots to the face. In a matter of moments, the vibrant lives of his family had been extinguished, with the blood of his wife and children staining his hands. Neil walked to the bathroom and turned on the shower. He stood under the water, numb, as if washing away the sins he could no longer escape. When the shower ended, he dressed, swallowed a cocktail of Vicodin and Xanax, in a haze, left his home. As he drove, the pills began to take effect, making him groggy and disoriented. Less than a mile from his mother's house, Neil passed out behind the wheel, swerving off the road and coming to a stop in the grass. Neil had initially planned to kill his mother, next before taking his own life. But in his twisted state, something inside him held him back. He later told the police that when he was at home, standing in a living room, he thought about going to heaven to be with his father, but he couldn't leave his mother alone, so he planned to take her with him. Thankfully, he never made it to her house. When the police found him, Neil was disoriented, barely conscious, and gripping the gun beside him. As they approached, he muttered, "I killed my family," in a dazed and broken voice. The investigation raised many questions. Was Neil a victim of the side effects of his medications, or had he planned this horrific act all along? A suicide note found later suggested that Neil may have been preparing for this moment, leaving many to wonder whether he was driven by his medications or if he had, at some point, simply snapped. His attorney's defense centered around his mental state. They argued that he had been suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and paranoia, all of which had been worsened by the medications he was taking. They described Neil overwhelmed by financial ruin, haunted by the fear that the FBI was watching him, and convinced that there was no way out. His legal team insisted that he had not acted out of hatred or rage but had instead been driven to an unimaginable breaking point due to the side effects of his prescription drugs. To support their argument, the defense brought in medical experts who testified about the dangers of Zoloft and Xanax, the two medications Neil had been prescribed before the murders. These drugs, they explained, could cause extreme mood swings, hallucinations, and suicidal tendencies, especially when taken together in high doses. Neil's behavior before the killings, his paranoia, delusions, and refusal to leave the house, was presented as clear evidence that he had lost his grip on reality. His lawyers pushed the narrative that Neil had been a loving father and husband, a man who had never shown any signs of violence before, making it hard to believe that he had killed his family intentionally. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They painted Neil not as a victim of medication but as a desperate man who had methodically planned the murders. They argued that his financial troubles had reached a boiling point, and that instead of facing them, he had chosen to take his family's lives in an act of ultimate control. They pointed to the way he had executed the killings, retrieving his gun, reloading it multiple times, and ensuring that no one survived. To them, this was not the act of a man lost in a haze of confusion but one who had made a deliberate and calculated decision. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence against Neil was the suicide note found in his home. The note indicated that he had thought through his actions and accepted what he was about to do. It wasn't the frantic scribblings of someone in the middle of a psychotic episode, it was organized, reflective in the prosecution's view, proof of premeditation. If he had truly been unaware of his actions, why would he have left behind such a message? The prosecution also called witnesses to testify about Neil's behavior leading up to the murders. His sister, Deborah, had noticed a dramatic shift in his personality. He had become increasingly paranoid. His wife, Frankie, had confided in Deborah that Neil was no longer the man she had married. He had stopped showering, refused to leave the house, and seemed trapped in his own mind. While the defense used these accounts to argue that Neil was suffering from a mental breakdown, the prosecution used them to show that there had been warning signs, signs that should have led Neil to seek professional help instead of resorting to murder. Neil's mother, Goldie, also played a heartbreaking role in the trial. She had been one of the last people to see him before the tragedy. She recalled how Neil had told her, "Mom, I love you, no matter what happens." The courtroom fell silent. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it, but in hindsight, it was clear he had been preparing for what he was about to do. Goldie, who had always seen her son as a kind and loving man. She struggled to reconcile the Neil she knew with the one on trial for murder. As the trial progressed, the jury was left to decide whether Neil Jacobson had truly been in a state of antidepressants-induced psychosis or if he had coldly and deliberately murdered his wife and children. The prosecution emphasized that Neil had made a series of conscious choices, loading his gun, aiming at his loved ones, and pulling the trigger multiple times. They argued that no matter what struggles he was facing, nothing justified what he had done. The defense, on the other hand, urged the jury to consider his mental state, to see him as a broken man who had been consumed by fear, paranoia, and desperation. After days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge, while acknowledging the tragedy of the situation, made it clear that no level of financial distress or mental illness excused the murder of innocent children and a devoted wife. Neil Jacobson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed, and the courtroom was filled with an overwhelming sense of loss. Neil Jacobson reached a plea deal with the state. He changed his plea from not guilty to guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. He stated that the reason was the family's mounting financial situation. Now, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Neil Jacobson answered to the judge in the Palm Beach County courtroom, admitting that he shot his wife, Frankie, and then shot their twin 7-year-old sons while they were asleep in their Wellington home back. During the family's turn to speak in court, Neil held his head down and never looked up. Even after the trial ended, many questions remained. Could this tragedy have been prevented if Neil had received different treatment? Were the medications to blame, or was he simply a man who refused to face his failures? No one could say for certain what had driven him to this point. However, What was undeniable was that a mother and two young boys had lost their lives in the most horrific way possible. Nothing could ever undo that. Hey detectives, welcome back. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Lauren Malt. While at university, Karen met Nigel Malt, a man with ambitious career goals. Their relationship started off well and seemed promising for starting a family. Although Karen's mother was concerned about Nigel's rude behavior, she chose to ignore this advice. They later married and had a daughter, Lauren Malt, who was born on April 8, 2002. Initially, Karen and Nigel's life together appeared happy, and they seemed to have a bright future ahead of them. However, over time, Nigel began to manipulate Karen. He used typical abuser tactics, suppressing her emotions with lies and appealing to her feelings of pity, which made her dependent on him. She was financially dependent on her husband and was unable to continue her studies due to pregnancy, making it difficult for her to find a job later on. Nigel had a long history of addiction to alcohol and prohibited substances. By this time, he was unable to function without these substances, which led to serious consequences for his life and family. Nigel had been a kind person before, but as his addiction worsened, his personality changed dramatically. He became aggressive and cruel toward Karen. Nigel's violent outbursts increased, and he began to take his anger out on Karen, eventually leading to physical abuse. Things worsened when their daughter, Lauren, observed the abuse. Despite this, Karen fought hard to save the relationship. By the time she could no longer take it, they had 4 children together. The thought of divorce was terrifying, especially with a long legal battle ahead. Their joint assets were minimal, and the prospect of being a single mother to 4 children worried Karen. She was particularly stressed about child support and custody, fearing that her husband Nigel might try to gain custody of the children just to hurt her. At this time, everyone was tired of Nigel's irresponsible behavior. He used to earn money and support his family, but now he had started to waste almost all of his income on alcohol and prohibited substances. Karen was very concerned about the impact this had on their children, who were growing up in fear. Their father drank every day and often abused their mother in front of them. This situation could not go on forever, but Karen was patient for a long time. Despite her family and friends urging her to leave him, she stayed for the sake of her children. It became clear that Nigel could not change. Karen decided to talk to Nigel about getting a divorce, which led to another angry outburst from him. He refused to pay alimony, making his stance clear to her. However, she and the children no longer wanted to live with someone so dangerous. The conversation ended in another conflict, filled with threats, which only strengthened Karen's resolve to leave her unfit husband as soon as possible. In March 2021, Karen reported Nigel's violent behavior to the police after a violent fight broke out while he was drunk. Karen later withdrew her testimony to spare him trouble, hoping that he would cooperate and consider a peaceful divorce. However, his failure to take responsibility made the situation worse. In April, Karen experienced an even more severe beating, which left her terrified for her life and concerned for her children. Realizing she needed to take action to end the abuse, she contacted the police again to report the domestic violence. Taking advantage of the moment Nigel was taken to the police station, she decided to escape with her children to her mother's house. However, he posted bail and was released while awaiting further legal action. He was placed under house arrest and tried to manipulate her emotions by claiming he would end his life. But this no longer affected Karen. She was determined to act strongly and see things through to the end. To show Nigel that she was serious, she attempted to obtain a restraining order, but unfortunately, this effort failed. During this time, financial troubles worsened, leading Nigel to drink more heavily and become increasingly aggressive, cruel. He could not control his anger, treating not only his wife poorly, but also Lauren and their sons. Finally, Nigel was found guilty of domestic violence and received a suspended sentence. He was prohibited from contacting Karen and the children. During this time, he lost everything. Karen left him and refused to listen to any excuses or promises. He also lost touch with his children, who were no longer interested in seeing him because of his unpredictable and cruel behavior. Alcohol, which he had developed a daily habit of consuming, was banned, and he was unable to control his addiction. It appeared he was using alcohol as a way to cope with the hope of reconciling with his wife. However, Karen was firm in her decision and demanded a divorce. All of this has left Nigel feeling demotivated. Despite his promises to stop using prohibited substances, his condition worsened. He claimed this was due to his need to cope with his problems. The issue of alimony needed to be addressed, as it was nearly impossible for Karen to support 4 children alone. Karen found a job as a salesperson, but her income was insufficient. To help, their daughter Lauren took on several part-time jobs. Meanwhile, Karen's lawyer reassured her that she didn't need to worry about custody. Nigel was a severe alcoholic, and due to allegations of violence, he could be completely barred from seeing the children. At this time, Lauren's relationship with her father, Nigel, was strained, so she only wanted to communicate with her mother. During this time, Karen and her children lived in her grandmother's house in a small village called West Winch in Norfolk County, UK. Lauren turned 19 during this time and was dating a guy named Arthur. On Sunday, January 23, 2022, Arthur took Lauren to work at the store where she was employed as a salesperson. Throughout the day, Nigel called his daughter, Lauren, multiple times. It was unclear what he wanted, but she suspected he was in an unstable state. To avoid distractions at work, she chose not to engage in any conversations. After a long and tiring shift, Lauren returned home, hoping to unwind with her boyfriend before starting her next shift the following day. She was working hard, including overtime, to save money for her education. That evening, Nigel began calling again. It was clear he was not sober. Lauren decided to ignore his calls, hoping he would calm down. However, he was relentless, calling 19 times between 6:25 p.m. and 6:52 p.m. Despite the constant ringing, Lauren remained silent. Unfortunately, ignoring Nigel was no longer an option. He lived just 10 minutes away, making it easy for him to show up unannounced. At around 7:01 p.m., Nigel called Lauren, and she answered out of fear that not responding would escalate things further. Their conversation was brief and quickly turned hostile, filled with insults and threats. Lauren tried to calm her father, but her efforts only seemed to infuriate him more. According to Arthur, Nigel arrived at Lauren's house at 7:21 p.m., while Karen was at work. He was clearly drunk and acted aggressively. Lauren stepped outside, attempting to de-escalate the situation, but he responded with insults and tried to provoke a fight. He swung the crowbar and nearly hit her several times. After several attempts to grab her, he threatened to attack Arthur, who had been with her. Eventually, Lauren prompted Nigel to leave, expressing her desire to avoid further communication with him in that state. Lauren attempted to get Nigel into the car to make him leave, but unexpectedly, he began screaming again. He jumped into his car, and just as Lauren was behind it, he suddenly reversed and ran over his own daughter. He paused for a few seconds, staring at her through the windshield. She was seriously injured, bleeding and screaming for help, but he did nothing. He didn't even get out of the car or call for an ambulance. Instead, he pressed the gas pedal and ran over Lauren a second time. It all happened so fast that Arthur couldn't react in time to assist her. The commotion drew the attention of neighbors, who called the police. One man rushed into the street, trying to stop Nigel, the crazed driver. Nigel saw Lauren lying on the ground, moaning in pain with serious injuries, but she was still alive. The neighbor realized that calling an ambulance was urgent, as Lauren had sustained injuries that would prevent her from being moved. However, Nigel was indifferent and insisted that everything was fine, claiming Lauren only had a few scratches. He pushed away the neighbor and Arthur, who were shouting at him to stop and call for help. Instead of calling emergency services, Nigel picked up Lauren and placed her in the passenger seat of his car. As he did this, Lauren moaned in pain, especially when Nigel tried to push her into the car. She was unable to sit up straight or maintain her balance due to her injuries, which likely included fractures. Nigel didn't even buckle her seatbelt, causing her to roll onto the floor in front of the passenger seat. While driving, he called his ex-wife, Karen, and began to tell a confusing story about an incident in which he accidentally injured Lauren. He was drunk, and his explanation was muddled. Karen didn't fully understand what was happening, but decided to wait for Nigel to arrive at her workplace. Nigel insists that Lauren is not seriously injured and wants to inform Karen so that Karen can take her to the hospital. He admitted that he couldn't do it himself because he had been drinking and was afraid of losing his driver's license. He drove directly to the parking lot in front of the store where Karen worked. Upon seeing Lauren's condition, Karen realized that Nigel had downplayed the severity of the situation. Lauren was in critical condition, and Karen struggled to lift her from the floor into a seat. During this time, Nigel merely watched in silence. Lauren showed no response. It appeared she could lose consciousness from the pain. Eventually, Karen called for an ambulance. Lauren was taken to the hospital, where doctors quickly realized her injuries were severe and could only be treated at a specialized medical center. They did everything possible to save her life. Unfortunately, a few minutes after she was on the operating table, her heart stopped beating. Meanwhile, the police arrived at the scene where Lauren was stabbed. There, they met Arthur and the neighbors, who witnessed the horrific incident. Bloody tire marks were visible on the driveway, evidence left by Nigel. Unlike many other crimes, there was enough evidence to bring immediate charges. The medical examiner evaluated the injuries of Lauren, who was the victim of a double car crash. She suffered a broken back, which caused her to lose her balance and fall onto the car floor. Her rib cage was severely damaged, multiple ribs were broken, her lungs were torn, and she experienced significant internal bleeding. The traumatic injuries to her chest and abdomen were fatal, as many of her internal organs were crushed or harmed by bone fragments. It was clear that she had been run over by a car, and she might have survived the first collision. After the second collision, she might have had a chance of survival if she had not been pushed into the car by Nigel and fallen, and if paramedics had been called immediately. Unfortunately, her fall to the floor of the car made her condition worse, and the delay ultimately claimed her life. Nigel Malt was quickly apprehended. It was discovered that he was highly intoxicated, with a blood alcohol level more than twice the legal limit for driving. Karen believed his aggressive behavior was solely due to alcohol or prohibited substance use. After his arrest, Nigel refused to cooperate with authorities. Nigel provided basic details about his name and address to the police, but refused to discuss the incident. During the preliminary hearing, he denied any wrongdoing, despite clear evidence against him. He explained that he went to see Lauren that evening after she didn't answer his calls, and then spoke to him rudely. He tried to talk to her, but she was unresponsive because he was leaving and planned to talk later. As he backed his car out, he felt a slight thump, but assumed he had hit a box or a rock that he hadn't seen in the rearview mirror. He had no clue that he had run over his own daughter. When he backed up to check what he had hit, he accidentally ran over her again. This is clearly a dishonest excuse from a coward who dares not admit his guilt. The detectives observed how unemotional he was when discussing his daughter's death, and it seemed to have no effect on him. In conversations about his family, he often spoke of Karen and Lauren with disdain. This situation was completely baffling. Nigel's wife, Karen, was a good woman devoted to her family. Lauren grew up to be just like her mother, a decent person. Despite the difficult home life caused by Nigel, she avoided alcohol and other harmful substances. Instead, she focused on her education, career, and improving her life. The neighbor and Lauren's boyfriend, Arthur, contradicted Nigel's assertion that the incident was accidental. They claimed that after Nigel ran over her while reversing, he paused for a few seconds, shining his headlights on her. Nigel could not have missed her at that moment. Then, he intentionally ran over her a second time. This could not have been an accident. Even if he didn't see her the first time, she was clearly in his line of sight the second time. The neighbor claimed that there was a conflict between Nigel and Lauren that evening. He described Nigel as aggressive and unkind. Even when Nigel hit Lauren with his car, he showed anger on his face and did not stop. The neighbor believed that the violence started because Lauren was simply asking him to leave. The police have obtained new evidence. While the neighbor attempted to talk to Nigel, several local residents recorded the incident with their cameras and phones from their windows. This footage was later presented in court. It clearly showed Nigel intentionally running over Lauren, and the prosecutor's office argued that the initial incident was also not an accident. Even the defense lawyer acknowledged that what happened could hardly be seen as a mere coincidence. The defense attorney focused on arguing that the murder was unintentional, but this argument lacked credibility. However, the bloody tire tracks and Nigel's tire tracks were a perfect match. Given the undeniable evidence, Nigel Malt was found guilty. In September 2022, a hearing was held where the sentence was announced. Nigel Malt was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 18 years before he could apply for parole. The court noted that Karen's claims of domestic violence were considered when determining the sentence. Karen's family made it clear that they would remain involved. Karen stated in a media interview that she would attend every parole hearing to ensure that Nigel did not get released. At the sentencing hearing, Nigel relied on crutches for support throughout the proceedings. He maintained his innocence, claiming the incident was an accident. Many believed he was trying to gain sympathy from the court by portraying himself as a victim, a tactic he often used with Karen. Others saw this as just punishment for a man who had killed a child. Karen had decided to proceed with the divorce, feeling ashamed to be associated with a man who killed his own daughter in a drunken rage. He had used his car as a weapon, running over her twice and leaving her no chance of survival. Given these circumstances, Karen felt the sentence was too lenient and believed Nigel should never be released. Karen argued that he was a dangerous and cruel man who had completely lost control due to excessive drinking and the use of prohibited substances. She warned that if he were released, he would continue to kill. It was only a matter of time. Notably, Nigel's sons have repeatedly stated that they would only feel safe if their father remained in prison for life. The case has created great public outrage, leading to much discussion about protecting children and spouses from domestic abusers. Activists are calling for harsher penalties for individuals like Nigel, including life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, no substantial changes have been made so far. At around 4 p.m. on Friday, April 15, 2011, in Lorgues, France, 27-year-old Alexander Durand was on his way home when he received a call from his younger sister, Séverine. She was a high school student, and the siblings had a close relationship, often calling each other. However, today she called not to share good news or weekend plans. Instead, she informed him that their mother, Kille, had not picked her up after school as she usually did. The day before, Séverine had been with their father, who had taken her to school in the morning. She had tried calling their mother multiple times, but her calls went unanswered. This was unusual because their mother was normally very responsible, and there was no reason for her not to come and pick up her daughter. Severine was worried that something might have happened, such as an accident. She advised Alexander to check the situation and visit their mother's house. Alexander was also worried, so he called his mother several times, but received no response. Finally, he decided to visit his mother's house himself. When Alexander arrived, Severine was already there, but she was still very anxious, even more than before. She was in the house with the gendarmes, and what they discovered was very concerning. Killette's car was parked in the driveway, the doors were unlocked, and the keys were in the ignition. 52-year-old Killette had vanished without a trace. The keys to the house were also in the car, so Alexander took them and went inside to see what was happening. The house was completely empty, as if she had simply disappeared. The gendarmes quickly began their search for Killette since the situation was becoming increasingly alarming. Initially, they suspected a robbery, but they found that nothing was stolen from the house. The doors and windows were untouched. In the back seat of the car, they discovered Killette's purse, which held all her identification, bank cards, and cash. She could not have left willingly without those items. Tension heightened. Even after 3 hours of searching, there was still no news. Both the house and the car were thoroughly examined, but no leads emerged. As a result, the search area was expanded to include the outskirts of the town. None of the neighbors had seen anything out of the ordinary, no suspicious noises or activity near Killette's home. To learn more about her, the police interviewed her relatives. Killette, a divorced mother of 4, was known for her reserved and calm demeanor. She was not someone who would spontaneously disappear. She had no mental health issues or addictions. At the time, Killette was working as a supermarket manager. She was polite, punctual, and a devoted mother. Everyone who knew her was confused and did not understand what had happened, as she had no troubling relationships and no history of violence. The evidence suggested that Killette's disappearance was not accidental. The police believed that whoever was involved in this incident was someone she was very familiar with. At the very least, Killette had allowed this person into her house or had given them the right to enter. After investigating, the police identified the primary suspect. She lived by herself in a small 2-story house. To save on expenses, she rented the first floor to a man named Bernard. During his interview, Bernard made some strange and unsettling remarks. He speculated on how Killette might have been abducted, suggesting that she could have been struck on the back of the head, rendering her unable to call for help. He also provided a detailed account of her medical condition, noting that she was diabetic and needed urgent assistance to avoid serious health consequences. His level of knowledge about Killette raised suspicions among the police. Furthermore, Killette's son, Alexander, revealed that Bernard was in love with his mother, which could explain his insight into her behavior and routines. This revelation increased suspicions, as Bernard could potentially have a motive. Alexander noted that, despite Bernard's interest, his mother did not reciprocate and had no intention of developing anything beyond friendship. She was solely focused on her children and her work, completely dismissing the idea of a romantic relationship with Bernard. When detectives investigated Bernard's background, they found that he had a criminal history. In 1999, he assaulted his girlfriend with a weapon after she tried to end their relationship. His ex described him as very hot-tempered and unable to control his rage. As a result of these incidents, suspicions about Bernard increased. Killette's lack of interest may have caused him to become angry, and what happened next remains unclear. In 1999, Bernard received a brief 6-year prison sentence for an attack, mainly because the girl he attacked survived. Now, he was called to the police station for questioning as the primary suspect in Killette's disappearance. The police were trying to determine when Killette went missing, and Bernard claimed to have useful information. He reported that on the afternoon of April 14, 2011, while watching television, he heard noises coming from the 2nd floor, where Killette had lived. He could hear footsteps on the wooden floor, but then everything went quiet. He did not see Killette leave, making it likely that he was the last person to have seen her. However, the police were concerned about Bernard's behavior. He was unable to recall the exact time of the noises or even remember what show he was watching, raising further suspicions. Bernard's main problem was that he didn't have a verifiable alibi. However, there was no evidence against him, so the police had to let him go. The next morning, officers came to inspect his house. Bernard greeted them with shouts and was initially unwilling to let them enter. Eventually, he agreed to show them around the first floor of the rented property but continued to make odd comments. Notably, he pointed out a hatch that led to the basement. He remarked that if he had killed someone, he would have hidden the body there, yet he insisted he was innocent and claimed the basement was empty. Upon inspection, there was indeed no one there. Meanwhile, when law enforcement searched Killette's home, they discovered suspicious stains believed to be washed blood, but this could not be confirmed. Despite the lack of evidence, suspicion remained around Bernard. Deciding to keep a close watch on him, the detectives sought to establish the exact time of Killette's disappearance, but clues were scarce. She had been alone for several days with minimal contact with her neighbor until April 15th. Anything could have happened during that time. Investigators began to piece together her movements, partly based on Bernard's statement that he had heard loud noises from the floor above on April 14th, the day before she vanished. As the investigators looked into the case, they realized that no one had seen Killette since April 15th. They managed to locate her friend, who stated that he had last seen Killette on April 14th around 3:30 p.m. at a gathering with mutual friends. He mentioned that after leaving the party, she got into her car intending to drive to Dickinson but planned to stop at home first. This was the only information available and was considered a starting point for the investigation, as more than 40 hours had passed since she went missing. Communicating with Killette's friend helped them determine a rough timeline for when she went missing. In her car, investigators found not only her personal belongings but also her mobile phone. They began analyzing the phone to see whom Killette had communicated with in the hours leading up to her disappearance. Notably, there was a call that lasted about 40 seconds, made shortly before 3:30 p.m. The call was from Sylviane Fabre, Killette's ex-husband's sister. Sylviane was contacted, and she stated that she had met Killette during Killette's marriage to her brother. At that time, Killette's relationship with her husband was not very good, so they decided to separate. However, afterward, the former spouses and their families managed to maintain friendly relations. Sylviane mentioned that back in 2008, they collaborated with Killette to invest money in a joint business. Shortly before Killette's disappearance, the business partners had a small conflict regarding these assets, but Sylviane claimed that everything was resolved, and they continued to work together. Together, Sylviane and Killette created a real estate company that generated a substantial income, which provided Sylviane with a potential motive. Not only were they distant relatives, but they also had shared finances and property, which can often lead to such conflicts. Naturally, Sylviane denied any wrongdoing. Killette's daughter mentioned that Sylviane often had conflicts regarding their joint activities. They could argue and reconcile several times a day. However, Killette's daughter described all these disputes as minor issues that were resolved quickly. The gendarmes checked Sylviane's schedule for the last few days. She had an alibi confirmed by her son. For almost the entire duration of the investigation, suspicions against Sylviane were not substantiated, and the search operation again hit a dead end. On April 17, 2011, the prosecutor's office began a judicial investigation into the disappearance of Killette. With no leads left and all suspicious individuals cleared as unlikely suspects, there was no option but to notify the media and hope, with their assistance, to obtain new witnesses who might have noticed something. At a recent press conference, officials announced that while there were priority leads in the criminal investigation, no suspects had been identified. This news sparked significant interest among journalists, as the case could potentially involve themes of business, money, love, or betrayal. Consequently, rumors began circulating about Killette immediately, some of which were quite alarming. Her information, background, and photos quickly became prominent in newspapers and on television. Her children expressed their desire to see her again and shared how difficult her absence was for them. The most concerning aspect was that the critical 48-hour window for finding her alive had already passed, significantly diminishing the chances of a successful rescue. While the prosecutor's office hoped to gather new leads from the public through the media, the police were actively searching the nearby villages. Following the press conference, the search area was widened, and a special investigative unit took over the case. Killette's disappearance began to attract national attention. The media frenzy intensified as they attempted to connect her case with another notorious crime that had recently shaken France. A few days before Killette went missing in early April 2011, 5 members of the Dupont de Ligonnès family, including the wife and 4 children, were found murdered under the terrace of their home in Nantes. The head of the family, Xavier, disappeared shortly after the murders, having been spotted on the outskirts of the city on April 15. Authorities believe Xavier was responsible for the crime, and he was placed on a nationwide wanted list. Notably, the location of the massacre was only 30 kilometers from Killette's home. The media quickly linked these incidents together. The timing coincided with Killette's likely disappearance, raising the possibility that Xavier kidnapped her. An even stranger coincidence was that the Dupont de Ligonnès family lived in a house that Killette had sold in 1992. Xavier was viewed as a respectable citizen, a devoted husband, and a caring father who was engaged in his community and known for his honesty and fairness. However, it later emerged that Xavier was deep in debt at the time he murdered his family. Just days before the killings, he purchased cement, tools, and 4 bags of lime, suggesting he had a motive and was preparing for the crime. Journalists speculated that Xavier may have had a grudge against Killette, but the reason for his potential revenge remained unclear. Rumors spread quickly, with theories ranging from a fraudulent real estate deal to unrequited love. Others suspected it could be part of a planned escape. Xavier could have taken Killette so they could be together again. Witnesses came forward, claiming they had seen Xavier's car near her home. Some even reported seeing him stop in town on April 14. Although these accounts seemed unlikely, detectives noticed clear connections between Xavier and Killette. This led them to investigate the possibility that the two had escaped together. Consequently, Killette shifted from being seen as a victim to potentially being viewed as an accomplice in crimes that might have involved Xavier's family. However, friends and family of Killette quickly disputed this theory, asserting that she was not capable of cruelty. As detectives explored new leads that emerged almost daily, they became convinced that there was no romantic or conspiratorial link between Xavier and Killette. They began to feel that the similarities between Xavier and Killette were merely coincidental or tragic coincidences. To definitively eliminate this theory, they decided to examine both Xavier's and Killette's mobile phones. They encountered a challenge. Xavier's phone could not be tracked, and there were no calls or messages from Killette's phone to his. After their investigation, they found no evidence of any contact between the two after the sale of the house. Although the theory regarding Xavier was intriguing, it ultimately consumed valuable police time and resources. 3 weeks after Killette's disappearance, any possible link to Xavier was dismissed. Xavier himself was never found, leaving the French police at an impasse. The case has reached a dead end and will not make any progress until at least May 15, 2011. On this day, about 30 kilometers from Lorgues, 2 tourists were returning from a forest hike and taking photos. While using a remote path to capture some scenic shots, they were hit by a strong, unpleasant smell coming from the side of the path. One of the tourists decided to investigate the source of the odor. As the woman approached a pile of stones, the smell intensified and became unbearable. When she moved one of the stones, she discovered a leg protruding from beneath the rocks. The tourists quickly called the police. Within minutes, gendarmes arrived at the location and found the body of a woman in an advanced state of decomposition, making it difficult to determine her gender. Only her clothing provided a clue. The police attempted to identify the victim but were initially unsuccessful. They took photographs of her clothes, accessories, and jewelry, which were then shown to the families of various women who had gone missing in the area. Among those families were the children of Killette. Her daughter and son recognized their mother based on what she was wearing. Although the gendarmes believed they had identified Killette a month after her disappearance, they chose to wait for more conclusive evidence. DNA analysis was necessary to confirm family ties, as appearance alone could not provide definitive proof. Ultimately, the examination verified the police's suspicions. The body was indeed identified as Kille Durham. On May 17, 2011, an autopsy was conducted on the body that had been found at the Forensic Medical Institute. Unfortunately, the condition of the remains was so poor that the exact cause of death could not be determined. The forensic expert did confirm that Kille had not been abused before her death, but it did not help the police make much progress in the case. As a result, the investigation into her disappearance shifted focus to a murder investigation. On June 9, 2011, Kille's body was buried. Law enforcement officers attended the funeral, knowing that criminals sometimes show up at such events to witness the impact of their actions. Some may seek to relive their emotions, while others might derive satisfaction from seeing the grief of the victim's family. Several officers remained in vehicles, while others blended in with the attendees, discreetly observing the proceedings. During this time, the police noted that Sylvian, Kille's business partner and sister-in-law, was missing from the funeral. Although Sylvian and Kille were close, Sylvian's absence raised suspicions. This concern increased a few days later when Sylvian attempted to end her life. Although she survived with minor injuries and poisoning, her actions were alarming. When the police arrived after a call from Sylvian's neighbor, they found Sylvian lying on her couch at home. She was unable to fully express herself, so she was taken to a medical center for assistance. However, the officers did not leave empty-handed. They discovered a lengthy letter addressed to her son, David Perel, which was several pages long. While the letter did not contain explicit confessions regarding her actions concerning Kille, the detectives interpreted it as a potential admission of guilt prior to her death. The police decided to speak with David, and he provided new insights into the troubled relationship between Sylvian and Kille. He believed that shortly before Kille's death, she and Sylvian had experienced a serious conflict related to their shared business. Intrigued, the detectives asked David to recount his activities on April 14th. He described the daytime as uneventful, but his account of the evening was much more compelling. On April 14th, at around 10 p.m., Sylvian asked David to drive her to Kille's house to discuss some important business matters. Her own car was broken, so she turned to him for help. However, on their way, his car also broke down a few kilometers from home. Despite the rain, they decided to walk back instead. He took the car battery with them, and together they returned in an attempt to fix the car. On the night Kille disappeared, this mother and son spent hours in the rain attempting to repair a car left outside the city. The gendarmes suspected that David was trying to create a questionable alibi to explain his absence from home. This suspicion was further fueled by Sylvian's initial statement to the detectives, in which she claimed she had spent the previous days at home. It seemed implausible that she could forget such a significant event. When Sylvian regained consciousness in the medical center, her account of the events changed. Her new story mirrored what her son had previously told, including all the important details. The gendarmes decided to investigate her claims. They found that on the night of April 14th to 15th, there was no rain in the area. Additionally, it was odd that Sylvian and her son were unable to flag down a passing car for a ride home. Why did they walk so far while carrying a battery with them? The road's vehicle monitoring system revealed that approximately 5 cars passed by during the time they were walking home. It seemed unlikely that none of these drivers would have stopped to assist them in the rain. This raised suspicions that David and Sylvian were hiding something and might be involved in the death of Kille. Unfortunately, there was no physical evidence to support these suspicions. As a result, the decision was made to keep a close watch on them over the next few months. Their phone calls were monitored, and on February 8, 2012, this surveillance yielded important information. The police intercepted a conversation between Sylvian and Bernard, who was Kille's neighbor. It became clear that Bernard knew much more than he had initially revealed. On April 14th, he not only heard sounds coming from above but also saw Sylvian's car arrive at the house, indicating he was aware of her actions. David, Sylvian's son, was also involved, as he was driving for his mother. On February 20th, 2012, David and Sylvian were arrested. Detectives viewed David as the weak link. During questioning, he quickly confessed, seeming relieved to unburden himself of his guilt. He revealed that on April 14th, they arrived at Killette's home around 3:30 p.m. Afterward, Sylvian lured her into a barn behind the house. A business dispute led to further conflict, during which Sylvian attacked Killette, beating her to the ground. Then, she took a rope from the barn and began to strangle Killette in front of David. Although he did not intervene or participate in the attack, he admitted to helping move the body afterward. They left Killette's body on the property, covering it with a tarpaulin. In the evening, when they fabricated the story about the broken car, they took the body out of town. David assisted Sylvian in dragging the deceased away from the road and covering her with stones. Despite David's confession, Sylvian denied any wrongdoing. She claimed the death was accidental and that they hid the body out of fear of the police. However, it was puzzling how well prepared she seemed for the crime, as she had latex gloves that prevented her from leaving fingerprints. After being detained for 48 hours, Sylvian was charged with murder, while David was released. Though he was viewed as an accomplice, his testimony needed verification, so he remained under judicial supervision. The next step was to determine the motive. It turned out that the motive was linked to financial issues. Sylvian's business was on the brink of failure when Killette uncovered that Sylvian was embezzling money from clients. Another possible motive was jealousy, as Killette was thriving while Sylvian's problems continued to grow. Shortly before the tragedy, Sylvian had gone through a painful divorce, and one of her 2 sons had been convicted of violence. Communication between her and David had nearly ceased, and his involvement in the crime marked the end of their close relationship. On January 21, 2014, David was charged in court with the murder of Killette. He claimed that he was only an accomplice and that he helped hide the body due to pressure from his mother. Sylvian, his mother, argued that the incident was an act of involuntary manslaughter. She explained that she had lost her temper after a conflict with her business partner, Killette, who was trying to take everything from her. Facing life in prison, Sylvian sought to downplay her guilt. The prosecutor's office looked into the role of the tenant, Bernard. Although he witnessed the conflict between Sylvian and Killette, he did not report it because he feared Sylvian. Ultimately, he testified as a witness for the prosecution. On January 23, 2014, the jury found Sylvian Fabre guilty of manslaughter, sentencing her to 30 years in prison. Bernard was acquitted, and David Perel received a 3-year suspended sentence. Over the years, Killette's children struggled to understand what had happened in that barn with their mother. Despite the complicated trial, they felt uncertain that the entire truth had been uncovered. They were unhappy with the court's verdict, believing that Sylvian had committed premeditated murder but had received a lenient sentence. Additionally, they felt Bernard was more involved than he had admitted and had evaded responsibility for the crime. The case of Killette Diram is a tragic and mysterious story that leaves many unanswered questions for her family and the community. Killette, a devoted mother, suddenly disappeared, leading to a lengthy investigation filled with suspicions of love, money, and betrayal. Ultimately, the truth was revealed through David's confession and Sylvian's sentencing, but was justice truly served? Bernard, the neighbor with a murky past, remains a significant question mark as he evades all charges. For Killette's children, the pain lies not only in losing their mother but also in the feeling that the secrets surrounding their mother's death may be buried forever. Heloisa Maria de Alencastro Souza was born in 2008 in Cuiabá, Central West Brazil. She lived peacefully with her mother, Suelen de Alencastro, and her grandmother. The family led a simple life, blending in with their community. Heloisa attended Adventist College in Centro Politico Administration, where she was a dedicated student. She was quiet in class, always completing her assignments and staying out of trouble. Heloisa didn't have many close friendships, but she did have one trusted friend with whom she shared personal thoughts. This friend later suggested that Heloisa displayed some traits of level 1 autism, although she was never officially diagnosed. Signs included her reserved nature, avoidance of eye contact, and anxiety in social situations. Despite this, Heloisa was warm and friendly with those she trusted. She had a deep passion for animals, aspired to become a veterinarian. She took her dreams seriously, researching veterinary programs from a young age. Her grandmother noted that she was responsible, helpful around the house, capable of cooking, cleaning, and caring for the family pet without needing constant supervision. She was an ordinary teenager focused on her future and goals, living a life that was steady, unassuming. Benedito Annunciaco de Santana was born in 1984 into a modest family and was the younger of two brothers. His older brother later became involved in a legal case related to a violent crime against his former partner. Their father was a laborer, while their mother stayed at home. The family lived in a suburb of Cuiabá. Neighbors noted that both boys were quiet from an early age and did not have a close relationship with their parents. As a teenager, Benedito began attending a local Catholic church and eventually started helping out during services. After finishing school, Benedito obtained an entry-level job at a local government agency. Through personal connections and a reputation for hard work, he gradually advanced in his career. At the time of these events, Benedito was the head of the Transportation Division at the Secretariat of Science, Technology, and Innovation in Mato Grosso. He earned a stable income, had access to a work vehicle, and was regarded as someone with a respectable social standing. In his daily life, Benedito often attended local events, expressed concerns about neighborhood problems, and suggested new initiatives. He stayed active in his church. On social media, he consistently shared religious posts, inspirational quotes, photos from events, and images of places of worship. Many of his pictures featured his son, Gustavo Benedito Jr. Lara de Santana, or were taken at churches and community celebrations. His online presence reflected the image of a stable, respectable man with strong faith. Not much is known about Benedito's personal life before he met Suellen. At the start of their relationship, he was not married and was not living with his son's mother. There are no official records of his past relationships. His behavior suggests that he deliberately kept details of his personal history private, only sharing information that supported his public persona. Suellen was employed at a government agency in Cuiabá, where she met Benedito. At first, he appeared confident, friendly. In the workplace, he was known as a dependable and dedicated employee. He was always polite, calm, and eager to assist his colleagues. This positive impression significantly influenced Suellen's choice to let him become part of her life. Their relationship reportedly started about 4 months before the incidents in question. The investigators found evidence that Benedito had full access to her home, often used her keys. This indicates that their relationship might have been more serious, long-lasting than it seemed at first. Benedito quickly became a regular part of Suellen's home life. He started visiting unexpectedly, moved around the house confidently, and appeared to integrate himself into their daily routines. To outsiders, it seemed he genuinely cared and was making an effort to be involved with the family. He was calm, rarely raised his voice, and had a knack for making others feel comfortable. Benedito was older, had a stable job, projected an image of responsibility, maturity. Suellen did not seem to notice anything alarming. She saw him as a source of support. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense. Heloisa's grandmother, who lived with them, felt uneasy about Benedito's frequent visits. It wasn't that she disliked him, rather, she found his overly polite and gentle demeanor insincere. Heloisa herself felt uncomfortable during their first interactions. Although she didn't confront him or create conflict, she made a point to avoid engaging with him. She confided in a close friend, expressing that Benedito made her uneasy, even though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. She was troubled by his gaze, his speech, and particularly the way he posed in photos. What concerned her the most were his social media posts, where he used hand gestures that reminded her of criminal symbols. She told her friend frankly that he appeared to have a shady background. Despite this, she chose not to share her concerns with her mother, possibly fearing she would be misunderstood. Heloisa's friend noted that Suellen seemed either unaware of Heloisa's change in behavior or didn't consider it important. No one in the household questioned Benedito's past, his acquaintances, or his previous relationships. His behavior never raised any alarms. A seemingly decent person had gained Suellen's trust without arousing suspicion. On Tuesday, April 22, 2025, at around 3 p.m., it was a typical weekday in Cuiabá. Sue Ellen and her mother were at work, leaving Heloisa home alone. She wasn't expecting any visitors, everything seemed calm. At that time, Benedito arrived at Sue Ellen's house in a government-issued Fiat Toro, which he used for his job at the Secretariat of Science and Technology. He had 3 teenagers with him, his son Gustavo and 2 others, aged 16 and 17. They had been instructed earlier and stayed hidden in the vehicle to avoid attracting attention from neighbors or security cameras. Their plan was to wait until there were no adults in the house. Benedito parked the car in the garage and entered the house alone. Surveillance footage showed that he was inside for about 15 minutes. He then returned to the car and left. The cameras did not capture anything unusual. He seemed calm. Neighbors did not report hearing any noise or seeing any signs of trouble. However, during that brief time, Benedito had let the 3 teenagers into the house. One of the confessions revealed that the group waited until Benedito left the property before executing their plan. Heloisa was inside the house alone when she saw strangers and became terrified. In her panic, she tried to escape to another room, but one of the intruders caught her. She was in shock, unable to scream or fight back. They tied her legs. Tragically, her life was taken in a room using a USB cable. At the time of the crime, Benedito was not in the house. He had reportedly left to take a work-related call. However, testimonies indicated he was aware of what was happening. Heloisa lost consciousness on the floor due to difficulty breathing. One of the attackers checked for her pulse and breathing but reported she was unresponsive. They then used ropes and bed sheets to move her body, wrapping it up, dragging it into another room to hide it temporarily. They ransacked the house to make it look like a burglary. Their next plan was to attack on Sue Ellen. By 6 p.m., Sue Ellen came home with a female relative who was holding an infant. Security cameras captured their arrival. Everything seemed normal outside, but inside, the assailants were preparing to strike. Although the lights were off, the air conditioning was running, raising Sue Ellen's suspicions. She called out for Heloisa but received no answer. As they entered the house, the 3 teenagers attacked Sue Ellen, overpowering her, hitting her, tying her up, and dragging her further inside. The woman with the infant was not harmed. She was instructed to sit quietly against the wall with the baby, not to interfere, while the attackers showed no aggression towards them. Sue Ellen was initially confused about the situation. She had been tied up, physically harmed, and locked away in one of the rooms. She thought a robbery was happening, suspected that her daughter might be tied up somewhere else in the house. The intruders did not provide any explanations, nor did they show their faces or give their names. However, at one point, Sue Ellen recognized one of the voices as belonging to Gustavo, Benedito's son. This realization made her understand that the attack was not random. While keeping Sue Ellen isolated, the intruders began to steal valuables from the house. They quickly loaded a TV, electronics, important documents, and the sheet covering Heloisa's body into Hyundai HB20. They used Sue Ellen's own car to transport the stolen items. Once they finished loading everything, the group left the house. Neither neighbors nor passers-by noticed anything out of the ordinary. Sue Ellen remained inside, still tied up and injured, unaware of the full extent of what had occurred. She believed that Heloisa had been taken away from her. No one had informed her of the truth. The crime was disguised as a robbery with an abduction. The scene was chaotic. Cabinets were forced open, the lights were off, and there was a mess everywhere. It resembled a typical break-in, but it had actually been meticulously planned. The perpetrators wanted it to look like a regular home invasion. Sue Ellen had no idea that the worst had already happened. Soon after the others left, Benedito returned to the house. He didn't go in immediately. Instead, he waited outside until he was certain everything was finished. Once inside, he found Sue Ellen bound and visibly shaken. She told him that a group of young men had broken in, attacked her, stolen items, and taken Heloisa with them. Benedito's reaction was exaggerated. He pretended to be surprised, anxious. He was merely acting as if it were the first time he heard the news. Benedito was the one who suggested taking Suellen to the nearest urgent care clinic. He posted on social media with a photo of Heloisa, making an emotional appeal for assistance, stating that she was missing and he needed everyone's support. His actions were carefully planned to portray him as a distressed, worried stepfather seeking help. When they arrived at the hospital, Suellen was brought in a wheelchair. Surveillance footage showed Benedito assisting her into the building, talking to medical staff, and staying close to her. He appeared to want to be seen, made no effort to avoid the cameras. Authorities quickly launched an investigation after receiving a report of an assault and possible abduction. While Suellen was receiving medical treatment, police took her statement, began collecting evidence. The first action was to track her vehicle, a Hyundai HB20 registered to Suellen. Surveillance systems monitored the car's route, capturing it traveling along Dubai Avenue and then toward the area between Ribeiro du Lipa and the highway leading to Guarujá. In that area, investigators found a white bundle made of bed sheets and evidence indicating the vehicle had stopped there. They also discovered an old concrete well in Ribeiro du Lipa, which is where the body had been hidden. The fire department was called to safely recover the remains. Forensic experts found that the lower legs had been bound, and there were marks around the neck suggesting restricted breathing. There were no clear signs of a physical struggle. A broken leg occurred, possibly from falling down the well. At this point, investigators started to focus on individuals close to the family. While reviewing surveillance footage, they noted Benedito's unusual behavior and his attempts to portray himself as a victim. Meanwhile, investigators began gathering information about Benedito's son, Gustavo. The first arrest happened quickly. A 17-year-old involved in the crime was found hiding in an apartment in a housing complex. He surrendered immediately, did not resist. During questioning, he provided a detailed account of the events, naming all those involved, including Gustavo, the second teenager, and Benedito, who he identified as the mastermind behind the plan. The teen explained how the group operated, where they hid, how tasks were divided, who created the plan, and how the crime was executed. With this information, investigators located Gustavo at his grandmother's house. Law enforcement arrested him without incident. Gustavo confirmed the details provided by the first teen, did not deny his involvement, and shared that his father had instructed him to gather people, outline the plan, actively involved him in the attack. His statement clarified that Benedito had initiated the entire scheme, that Gustavo participated in hopes of gaining his father's approval. The next arrest was of a 16-year-old who was found hiding in a messy lot in Tropicalville. He admitted to being involved in the crime but shared limited details. However, by the time he was arrested, the investigation already had a clear understanding of the situation. The recovered items matched the locations identified by various suspects, but the most important evidence came from their consistent testimonies. These statements outlined how the crime was planned, who was responsible for each part, their actions at different stages, and the order in which they occurred. Technical evidence had already linked Benedito to the central role in the crime, now it was reinforced by the direct confessions. Once all the individuals involved in the case were in custody, Benedito was brought in for questioning. Initially, he denied any involvement, claiming he was unaware of the crime, he equally shocked by what had occurred. His statements contradicted the confessions of the others. The investigators decided to set up a confrontation. The first meeting was between Benedito and a 17-year-old. When asked to speak, the teenager did not hesitate. He clearly stated that Benedito had given the instructions, taken them to the house, and left them to execute the plan. He identified Benedito as the mastermind, explained how he received specific directives. In his defense, Benedito labeled the teenager a liar, emotionally unstable. Benedito asserted that he would never allow harm to come to Heloisa and claimed he hardly knew the teenagers his son associated with. Things changed when Gustavo entered the room. He clearly stated that he had followed his father's commands. Investigators observed that this was when Benedito's story started to shift. He became vague, deflected blame, and avoided giving specifics. Later, Benedito provided a different account, saying that Sue Ellen had allegedly informed him that her daughter was exploring non-traditional personal identities and had supposedly asked him to remove any influence. He interpreted this as a prompt to take action. However, there was no evidence to support his claim. Heloisa's close friend told investigators that Heloisa had never shown romantic interest in anyone, shied away from personal topics, and had not pursued any relationships. Her family confirmed that she lived in a private world, showing no interest in intimacy or social connections. Benedito's attempt to blame Sue Ellen was viewed as a clear strategy to evade responsibility. Investigators found no evidence that Sue Ellen had any involvement in planning the crime. Benedito crafted a narrative to present himself as a victim, claiming he had misunderstood someone's words and hadn't given clear instructions. During psychological evaluations, investigators observed manipulative tendencies in his behavior. Benedito consistently influenced others while staying in the background, creating no direct links to his actions and controlling events from afar. Testimony from the teenagers made it clear that he was the key figure behind the actions, carefully avoiding direct involvement. He assigned roles, provided instructions, timed events, and maintained an external alibi. Additionally, it was revealed that in 2020, Benedito's biological brother was convicted of a violent crime against his ex-spouse. This attack occurred in broad daylight and resulted in fatal injuries. At the time, Benedito's brother was already subject to restraining orders but disregarded them. Although this was legally separate from Benedito's case, investigators noted a troubling history of aggressive behavior within the De Santana family. As the investigation progressed, Benedito's true nature came to light, revealing him as a manipulative and calculating individual. He not only got teenagers involved in a serious crime but also exploited his own son, believing Gustavo would stay silent. His behavior was cold and calculated, showing no remorse. Attempts to present an alternative story quickly fell apart. The testimonies of his accomplices, along with solid evidence, painted a clear picture against him. When confronted with undeniable facts during questioning, Benedito began to confess. He told investigators that just before the crime, he saw messages between Sue Ellen and her ex-partner, which he interpreted as a betrayal. He felt used and rejected, leading to a breaking point for him. He admitted that Heloisa annoyed him and recognized that she didn't accept him, always regarding him with suspicion. However, he denied harboring any personal hatred towards her, insisting he only wanted to restore balance in his relationship with her mother. This confession confirmed that the crime was premeditated rather than impulsive. It was not motivated by greed or fear of being caught. Instead, it stemmed from a personal desire for revenge, aiming to emotionally break someone and establish control, all while maintaining the facade of a respectable individual. The interrogation revealed that the physical aggression towards Sue Ellen was also planned, intended to incapacitate her, undermine her will, and create a false narrative of a robbery. Benedito aimed to manipulate Sue Ellen's condition and emotional shock to present himself as a concerned bystander and divert suspicion from himself. After the initial investigation, prosecutors confirmed that the case would be treated as a premeditated crime with aggravating factors. The presence of minors, the use of deceit, pre-planning, a government vehicle, and the false staging of an abduction all bolstered the prosecution's argument. Benedito Annunciaco de Santana was identified as the main suspect. He was arrested, suspended from his public position, and subsequently fired. By the time the investigation began, all suspects were in custody. The teenagers were moved to appropriate facilities, while Gustavo, who had just turned 18, was waiting for legal proceedings to take place in adult criminal court. The public's response was immediate and strong. The crime against the young girl, involving her stepfather, caused widespread outrage. Local media extensively covered the case. Central to the public's concern was the issue of trust. How could someone who seemed decent be capable of planning such a crime against his partner's daughter? Sue Ellen learned about her daughter's death while being treated by medical staff. After the assault, she had been taken to the nearest urgent care facility for help. At first, Sue Ellen thought her daughter had been kidnapped and held on to hope that she would be found alive. However, as the investigation continued and the body was discovered in a well, the police revealed the tragic truth. Sue Ellen reacted with intense grief and despair, Witnesses reported that Sue Ellen went into a state of hysteria, requiring sedation. Hospital staff recalled her screaming that she didn't feel alive, that everything was over, and that she somehow felt responsible. Later, while giving her testimony, Sue Ellen admitted she blamed herself for what happened. She realized she failed to recognize the true character of the man she had welcomed into her life. Benedito had seemed trustworthy, kind, and attentive. Only Eloisa had been wary of him from the start, but Sue Ellen dismissed her concerns as typical teenage defiance. Sue Ellen survived, but she was deeply affected by her experience, resulting in a loss that could never be reversed. The case is being investigated as murder, armed robbery, and child abuse. Eloisa's memory lived on, touching the lives of people beyond just her family. The school she attended released an official statement offering condolences and remembering her aspiration to become a veterinarian. Her relatives urged the public to be more careful about whom they invite into their homes, particularly regarding the safety of their loved ones. Although this family's story ended in tragedy, it served as a strong reminder that danger can often appear in the guise of kindness, and that the justice system's role extends beyond punishment to include prevention. Surveillance technology, law enforcement, and the analysis of digital evidence were essential in solving the case. However, the most crucial factor was our focus on the small details, those initial signs that indicated something was wrong. On July 29, 2016, Gabriella and her younger sister, Sunilda, started their day as usual. That evening, they planned to visit a nearby internet cafe to work on some school assignments. Because they didn't have internet at home, these trips to the local cafe had become a regular part of their lives. Going to the cafe was how they accessed the internet to stay connected and complete their assignments. Around 6 p.m., Gabriella and Sunilda left the house as usual, without causing any concern. But after walking a few blocks, Gabriella abruptly changed her mind. She told Sunilda that she wouldn't be accompanying her and that she was going to see her boyfriend instead. Sunilda was a little surprised but didn't ask any questions. Gabriella had gone off alone before. Gabriella assured her she would return soon, then walked away in the opposite direction. That was the last time the two sisters saw each other. Sunilda went to the cafe by herself. That evening, when she got home, she realized that Gabriella still wasn't back yet. Al principio, nadie le dio mucha importancia. Es como que los adolescentes se queden fuera hasta tarde, especialmente en verano. Sin embargo, a medida que anochecia, la preocupación empezó a aumentar. Liliana, their mother, tried to call Gabriella but got no answer. She sent messages on WhatsApp, which at first were not read. Later, the messages appeared as read, but Gabriella never replied. It was clear someone was seeing the messages, but not responding. Panic set in when a young man, whom the family believed to be Gabriella's boyfriend, showed up at their door. He asked a question that stunned everyone, because they had all assumed that Gabriella was with him. His confusion seemed real. He truly didn't know where she was. That moment changed everything. Until then, everyone had just thought Gabriella was out later than usual. If her boyfriend hadn't seen her that night, it's possible she never made it to meet him. That's when her family realized something was wrong. Sunilda remembered watching Gabriella turn a corner in the direction of a boarding house where one of their relatives had once lived. At the time, it hadn't seemed significant. The next morning, it was obvious that Gabriella was missing. Her phone was still active, but she didn't answer any calls. The mood at home grew tense. Her loved ones started reaching out to everyone they knew, relatives, friends, even her father, but nobody knew where she was. It seemed as though she had vanished without a trace. The family decided to take official action. Liliana contacted the local authorities, who then opened the missing person case. Soon after, flyers about the case were posted around the neighborhood. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers helped with the search. However, after Gabriella turned the corner and left her sister behind, no one saw her again. Gabriella Verol was born in Argentina in 1998 to Bolivian parents. Her parents separated when she was 6 years old. After her parents separated, Gabriella lived with her mother, Liliana Cham, and later started calling another man, Cesar Garcia, her father. He became her stepfather. Sunilda and other relatives from Liliana's family also lived in the same house. Life at home was difficult. The family made great efforts to create a stable home and meet their basic needs, but the atmosphere was often tense and arguments happened frequently. Gabriela frequently had stressful encounters with her grandmother, and their arguments were much more heated than typical family disputes. The adults were emotionally distant and didn't understand her, which constantly made her feel under pressure. During her teenage years, Gabriela faced the typical challenges of growing up. However, living in a home without personal space or privacy made these difficulties even harder for her. She didn't have a good place to rest or study. She dreamed of living with her biological father, who lived apart from her with another family. Pero ese deseo nunca se cumplió. Al no mantuvo una comunicación constante y también estaba enfrentando sus propios problemas personales. Eventually, the situation at home became too difficult for Gabriela to handle. She decided to leave, taking her younger sister Sunilda with her. For a time, they stayed at the house of their Aunt Marisol, their father's sister. The two sisters hadn't planned to leave permanently or thought it through carefully, but their leaving was a sign that something was wrong. They stayed at their aunt's house for about a week. Life there was more peaceful and there was less strict adult supervision, but this brief period didn't result in any lasting changes. When Gabriela returned to her mother's house, she once again found herself surrounded by the same pressure and stress she had tried to get away from. Although Gabriela was quiet, she was clearly independent. She wore simple clothes, avoided drawing attention to herself, and stayed away from noisy or boisterous groups. However, she was still ambitious. She often envisioned a future in which she could shape her own life. Unfortunately, her limited resources made it difficult to pursue those dreams. She didn't have a computer or reliable internet access at home. Even basic things like homework required her to walk to the nearest internet cafe. As mentioned before, this demanded extra planning and often led to more stress at home. In addition to these daily difficulties, Gabriela also felt a strong sense of emotional distance. Her opinions were often ignored, and her needs were rarely prioritized. Even within her own family, she felt more like an outsider than a real member. She never openly argued with her mother, Liliana. However, Liliana was always so overwhelmed by her responsibilities that she often didn't notice what her daughter was experiencing. Gabriela's stepfather fulfilled his duties, but they never developed a close relationship. There was always a distance between them. Over the years, all of this made Gabriela feel increasingly isolated. She didn't feel safe at home, and she couldn't see any realistic way to find support or make a change outside of it. Life felt like a cycle she couldn't escape, where any progress depended entirely on her own efforts. At home, there was a shortage of resources, emotional support, and space for her to grow. Her desire for independence was no longer just a normal part of growing up, it became a true necessity. This mindset began to guide her choices and actions over time. Against this emotionally vulnerable but outwardly calm backdrop, a series of events began to unfold. These events would eventually lead to devastating consequences. Nuestra Quintana, born in 1986, was married to Elizabeth Cham, who is Gabriela's maternal aunt. This marriage made Nuestra a member of Gabriela's family, and they frequently saw each other, as they lived in the same household. For a long time, no one in the family had any concerns about his behavior. They saw him as calm, reliable, and responsible, with a respectable job at the Argentine Prefecture, a federal security agency. He didn't raise any red flags. He stayed out of arguments, helped with household chores, and was present at family gatherings. He was a quiet part of everyday life. He lived with his wife and her family, ate meals with them, took part in family gatherings, and helped with daily chores. To those around him, he seemed like a reliable and discreet adult who handled family matters appropriately and never overstepped his boundaries. Over time, small, isolated incidents began to occur, minor things that didn't seem concerning at first, such as a strange remark or an odd situation. There was no single event, but these details gradually changed how people saw him. After he and Elizabeth separated, Nunister left the family home. He moved into a low-cost boarding house near the area where his family still lived. At the time, his relatives thought this was simply the usual thing to do after a marriage ended. This move marked a turning point. It began a new phase in which his behavior slowly changed from neutral to unsettling, even though no one could clearly describe why they felt uneasy. Even though Nunister no longer lived with the family, he still kept in touch with them, especially with Gabriella. As time passed, people started noticing that he was spending more and more time alone with her. These meetings took place outside the home, in neutral locations. Neighbors who witnessed these interactions were unsure how to interpret them. One man remembered seeing Gabriella and Nunister together on a bus. Gabriella was sitting on Nunister's lap while he softly stroked her hair. The man felt uncomfortable watching this but chose not to mention it to the family. He later admitted that he hesitated because he was afraid of causing a scene or damaging family relationships. He decided not to say anything. Other people in the neighborhood reported seeing similar things. Several residents had seen Gabriella near the boarding house where Nunister lived. At times, she would go into the building, remain there for an hour or two, and then leave quietly. No one expressed any concern when this happened. Because Nunister had once been married to Gabriella's aunt, no one thought their interactions were unusual at first. Their family relationship led people to trust them and not question their meetings. Gabriella never told anyone she visited him, and there was no obvious reason to suspect anything improper was happening. They also had no formal relationship. Nunister was not her guardian and had no legal right to be involved in her life. However, he was still somewhat connected to the family, so his actions were considered personal decisions and were not subject to supervision. Gabriella's family didn't keep track of where she was, believing she was either with friends or running errands. It was later revealed that many of their meetings took place at the boarding house where Nunister had rented a small room. He often invited Gabriella there, and they kept their visits private. She would arrive by herself and leave without drawing attention. Over time, their relationship changed in ways that went beyond simple familial affection. At the time, however, none of the adults realized how deep their connection had become. Even after his marriage to Elizabeth ended, Gabriella continued to seek contact with him. She never talked about what happened during those visits or shared any details with anyone. Only after she disappeared did people begin to understand the whole story, the clues they had previously missed. At first, there was no clear indication that Gabriella had any reason to keep secrets. She seemed calm and friendly around her relatives, but it later became clear that her relationship with Nunister was something she could not discuss openly. Reportedly, their connection began when Gabriella was just 13. At that point, Nunister was already a grown man, employed in a federal security role and married to her maternal aunt, which made the situation even more troubling. He was not just a stranger, he was a trusted adult in her home, connected to her family, and seen as safe by everyone around her. The first details of this story began to emerge when the investigation started. Friends who had never shown much interest in Gabriella's personal life began to comment. Several people admitted that they had suspected for years that something was wrong between her and Nunister. Some recalled seeing him repeatedly near Gabriella's school, offering her rides or finding reasons to be there. At first, his actions appeared to be motivated by concern, but over time they became more obsessive. The way he behaved was not what you would normally expect from a family member. He monitored her social life, tracked whom she spoke to, and showed signs of jealousy. Gabriella tried to maintain normal friendships, but Nunister's influence made her feel increasingly restricted. People close to her said that he constantly tried to contact her, often calling her repeatedly if she didn't answer immediately. Those who witnessed how urgently he needed to know her whereabouts at all times recognized this as a warning sign. In later messages used as evidence, he accused her of being distant, demanded explanations for her actions, and insisted that she account for how she spent her time when she wasn't with him. These were not isolated incidents, they formed a consistent pattern of controlling and obsessive behavior. Classmates remembered times when Gabriella would only attend events if he gave her permission. Initially, it appeared as if she was simply dealing with strict family rules or a difficult home situation. No one realized that the true reason was the pressure from an adult man who maintained a controlling environment around her. A close friend later recalled that Gabriella had once confided in her, saying she hadn't felt free in a long time and asking her to keep it a secret. At the time, it seemed like something typical a teenager might say. Later, those words would take on much deeper significance. Through the voice messages Nestor sent Gabriella, investigators made a disturbing discovery. He saw her as someone he possessed. In the recordings, his tone shifted between pleading and demanding. He accused her of cheating, doubted her honesty, and repeatedly insisted that she prove her loyalty. When Gabriella began spending time with someone her own age, Nestor started to act increasingly hostile. He made it clear that he could not tolerate her being close to anyone else, not even her friends. The investigation found that this caused tensions between them to escalate even further during that period. As Gabriella grew more distant, Nestor intensified his efforts to regain control. Meanwhile, her friends noticed that Gabriella's emotional well-being was deteriorating. She became increasingly anxious and withdrawn, and she stopped talking about her future. When she tried to leave Nestor, he responded by ramping up his manipulation. He pressured her psychologically, used emotional blackmail, made threats, and tried to make her feel guilty. Relatives living nearby had no idea this was happening. As investigators examined his actions more closely, a clear pattern emerged. He not only violated personal boundaries, but also purposely created a relationship of dependence by taking advantage of his age, his authority, and the trust the family placed in him. Gabriella's friends later confessed that, while they sensed something was wrong, they did not realize the seriousness of the situation. She remained silent out of fear, shame, and the conviction that no one would believe her if she told the truth. This silence allowed Nestor to maintain control over her for years. Gabriella grew up in a home without adequate support, which left her vulnerable. A man, initially only a relative, entered her life and gradually became a dominant presence from whom she could not escape. This situation paved the way for the tragedy that followed. After Gabriella went missing, the police launched an initial investigation. They questioned her sister, her mother, the young man she was dating, and several other acquaintances. Officers began searching the neighborhood and spoke with residents living within a few blocks of where Gabriella was last seen with her sister. Several witnesses reported seeing her later that evening walking down the street with a man. One witness specifically remembered seeing them heading toward the boarding house. Investigators believe that, given the time and place, Gabriella may have intentionally gone there. Meanwhile, some of Gabriella's friends, previously too afraid to speak up, began providing information. As more evidence was gathered, it became clear that Gabriella's disappearance was not accidental. There were no signs that she had run away or made a sudden decision to leave. She left without taking any belongings or informing anyone of her plans. After Nestor Quintana was identified as a person of interest, authorities brought him in for questioning. Initially, he appeared confident. He claimed he had not been in contact with the family for a long time, that he no longer knew anything about Gabriella's life, and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He explained that he stayed out of family matters because he and Elizabeth were divorced. At first, his answers seemed consistent. However, investigators soon found several contradictions. Neighbors and other residents reported seeing Nestor still meeting with Gabriella. Witnesses often saw them together near the boarding house, and her friends stated he behaved in a controlling manner, evidence that directly contradicted his previous statements. The investigators intensified their questioning. Nestor was summoned for additional interviews, and with each session, he grew less confident. He began muddling the timeline, changing his story, and avoiding direct questions. Even those who had initially believed he was not involved began to have doubts. The situation shifted noticeably a few days after the investigation gained momentum. Nestor arrived at the police station without prior notice and asked to speak with an officer. This time, he admitted to having had contact with Gabriella and claimed to know where she was. Then he made a confession that changed the whole investigation. He stated that, as on previous occasions, he met with Gabriella on the evening of July 29th. According to him, they had an argument that night. Nestor said the argument escalated and, during the struggle, he lost control and accidentally killed Gabriella by strangling her. He revealed the precise location of her body, explaining that he had hidden it in his room at the boarding house, wrapped in bed sheets and plastic. He claimed that he had acted impulsively during an emotional breakdown and had not planned the act in advance. Police quickly proceeded to the location he mentioned. There, in the room he had rented, investigators discovered Gabriella's body. It was carefully wrapped in several layers of fabric and plastic bags and placed in the corner of the room. Forensic specialists arrived at the scene, determining that the body had been in the room for several days. However, because the room was sealed, decomposition had been limited. Investigators collected all nearby items for forensic examination. An initial autopsy determined that the cause of death was manual strangulation. No signs of sexual assault were found, so investigators ruled out such a motive. However, the main question remained unanswered. If the motive was not sexual assault, what provoked such a violent reaction? Some believe the act resulted from long-term emotional stress, jealousy, and an adult's inability to accept Gabriella's growing independence. Only further interviews and psychological assessments could confirm whether this theory was correct. The authorities informed Gabriella's family of Nestor's confession. The shock was immense. Her mother, stepfather, and other relatives could not believe that someone they had lived with was capable of such an act. Nestor, once regarded as a caring uncle, had now admitted to causing her death. For many people, the news was more than just devastating. It completely destroyed their trust in those closest to them. Cesar Garcia, Gabriella's stepfather, told reporters that he was struggling to understand what had happened. He said that Nestor had never acted suspiciously and was always seen as a trustworthy, ordinary family member. Gabriella's sister, Sunsilda, did not make any public statements and remained in shock. Their mother was so overwhelmed by emotion that she burst into tears. The family's grief was made even worse by a profound sense of betrayal. Although Nestor confessed, the investigation continued. Law enforcement needed to confirm whether his statements were true and to ensure he was not withholding any other information. His claim that his actions were caused by an emotional outburst was questionable, especially since he had carefully concealed the body. Investigators also looked into whether Nestor was trying to minimize his role in order to receive a reduced sentence. This issue became part of the case as it proceeded to trial. After Gabriella's body was found and a confession was made, Nestor Quintana's case entered the formal criminal investigation stage, and he was officially charged. However, during the very first court hearing, the situation changed unexpectedly when Nestor suddenly retracted his confession. He stated that the police had pressured him, used psychological coercion, and had not properly informed him of his rights. This new statement formed the basis of his defense strategy. Nestor's lawyer promptly took action to dispute all evidence that had been gathered from the confession. He claimed that the boarding house was searched illegally because there was no valid warrant. The defense also requested the exclusion of text messages, voice recordings, and witness testimonies that were collected before a lawyer was present. They argued that Nestor was mentally unstable at the time and could not understand the consequences of his words. Prosecutors remained resolute. The lead attorney stressed that Nestor's confession was both voluntary and detailed. He also pointed out that Nestor provided exact directions to where Gabriella's body was found, arguing that such specific information could not have been a coincidence. Furthermore, evidence was collected that revealed a long-term pattern of control by the accused over Gabriella, including indications of psychological manipulation and jealousy. A key piece of evidence was finding Nestor's DNA under Gabriella's fingernails, which clearly showed there had been a physical struggle. Several witnesses testified in court. Gabriella's friends spoke about the emotional distress she experienced in the months before she disappeared, describing how Nestor tried to control her, limited her social interactions, and put her under significant emotional pressure. During the proceedings, a message was read aloud in which Nestor made threats. The content had a significant impact on the jury, prompting the defense to adjust its strategy. They described Nestor as someone who was emotionally unstable and acted impulsively due to extreme stress. They stated that his relationship with Gabriella was mutual but unofficial, and that what happened was not premeditated. These claims angered Gabriella's family. Her stepfather, in particular, spoke out after several hearings, saying that attempts to defend the accused were disrespectful to Gabriella's memory. During the trial, Gabriella's mother, Liliana, remained composed and attended every session. The family was clear and united in saying that this was not a domestic dispute. It was a betrayal that ended a life already controlled and suppressed. Their lawyers argued that this was not only a breach of trust, but Neuster's position as a family member made it even worse. The prosecution requested the harshest penalty, life in prison, because of the seriousness of the crime. They pointed to the close family relationship between those involved, the long-term psychological manipulation, and the deliberate effort to conceal the body. Once both sides gave their closing arguments, the jury was sent out to deliberate and make their decision. Tension filled the courtroom. Gabriella's family sat quietly, anxiously awaiting the verdict. When the jury returned, the foreperson announced the decision: guilty of first-degree murder, with aggravating factors due to the family relationship and gender-based violence. The judge delivered the sentence without delay. Neuster Quintana was sentenced to life imprisonment. The court dismissed the defense's argument that the confession was coerced, noting that it contained detailed information and was supported by physical evidence. The fact that there had also been long-term psychological control made the charges even more serious. Neuster remained expressionless as the verdict was announced. His lawyers sat in silence, staring at the floor. Across the courtroom, Gabriella's mother began to cry, and her husband held her in his arms. This was not a victory, but a painful farewell. Justice had been served, yet their daughter was lost forever.